Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the rest of you guys. Welcome back to a new episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. I am your host, Q, and we will be starting with our guest today, John Vallis, in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to give a quick shout out to everyone who was listening yesterday. We did, in fact, sell quite a few conference tickets. So you guys are going to reap the rewards for yesterday's good work by the listeners in the audience. We're going to drop today 4 different Sats codes that are going to be worth one whole dollar. What that means in the future remains to be seen, but big Sats drops are going to be coming up. We're going to have 2 early on, 1 in the middle, and 1 at the very end. So you'll want to stick around during today's entire episode if you want to get all $4. But in the meantime, I do want to remind everyone who has not yet already, be sure to get your conference tickets. They are going to go up in price again one final time this Friday. Use code YTMAG, get 10% off, and come hang out with us in Miami. I'm trying to figure out how to get weed over there because apparently now I'm not flying directly from LA anymore. So the offer still stands. If you find me and I'm not too busy working, I'll roll it up and we'll smoke a joint together. Also, before John gets here, I want to take some time to talk about some of the news that's been populating and will be scattered around just throughout today's episode. Specifically, though, I want to start with the news that Saudi Arabia and China are talking about. Saudi Arabia and China were talking about essentially removing themselves from a petrodollar system and introducing a petro yuan. Look, I've brought this up on this show repeatedly. I will beat this dead horse until it comes back to life for all I care. But the last time a country introduced a petro, insert another currency, was in about the late 90s when Vladimir Putin partnered with Saddam Hussein and they introduced the petro euro. I'm not saying everything is connected, but I'm saying that those things are very, very much connected between the petro euro being introduced and all of a sudden, for some reason, we think that Iraq is a place that has weapons of mass destruction, not to mention the fact that Bush Sr. sold it to them. But I don't know. Maybe I should have a tinfoil hat instead of my Lakers beanie on right now. Some Goblin Blueser DK, shout out to you. We did manage to ask you a question, yes, and I'm very happy that you enjoyed Samson's response. For those of you who did not get a chance yesterday to check out the episode, be sure to go and check out our interview with Samson Mao, both available here on YouTube. And if you don't want to do that, the podcast is up now live, I believe. Also happening live right now is a conference hearing in Congress, a House session. Now, I tried to listen to some of this a little bit earlier this morning. Maybe this is a hot take, maybe it's not, but I've come to a determination on a lot of these conference sessions or House sessions. They're just glorified staff meetings. You know, the staff meeting that like you and I have to attend where we're like rolling our eyes that why wasn't this all just in an email sent to everyone to just read, review on their own time and then come back with next steps? But instead, here we are in a staff meeting reading off said email that was sent out. Yeah, they're literally just reading off the executive order right now. They're not making determinations off of it. They're not making decisions off of it, at least not to my understanding or from the bits that I was able to catch so far. Don't forget, they're getting paid by our tax dollars to do exactly that. Just read off essentially an email that Joe Biden had sent out, more or less, or Joe Biden's aides sent out. They're getting paid U.S. tax dollars, yours and mine's tax dollars, to sit around in a room and just continue the conversation and pass the buck. Nothing is going to get done out of DZ. I think until some pressure is on. There was something promising I saw from another potential candidate for Senate out of, I'm trying to pull up the state right now. His name was Brian Solston, and he is running for Senate out of Washington. Yo, I gotta say, the fact that I can't very quickly Google search Brian Solston and see where you're running on behalf of is kind of ridiculous. You need a better social media team, Ryan Charleston. But I did find your page. I'm going to post it. It is Washington State. You are running as a Democrat. Um, I'm going to just say it. I'm going to say it like I say to everyone that is not in the U.S. Senate, and even some of the people in the U.S. Senate who say and talk about Bitcoin, but have actually never done anything for Bitcoin. Until you do something for us, I'm just considering you a grifter for votes. Show me what your policy stance looks like. You say you want to make and push Bitcoin to be legal tender. How? What are you going to do, and how are you going to approach it? Who are the people that you are going to align with, and how is that going to get done? Because that's a very, very big, lofty promise. It sounds really good on paper, but how are you going to execute that? I want to know. I genuinely want to understand, like, what, where, and how that happens, because otherwise you are just grifting for votes. No different than Biden saying he's going to wipe out student loan debt. No different than Trump saying he was going to drain the swamp. None of that shit ever came to fruition, guys. I take it with a very hefty and large dose of skepticism. Samson Mao put it very well. We have to be open to them hopefully following through. However, understanding that historically speaking, very rarely have they ever followed through on what they promised us. So why do we believe them now? Because they're promising the thing that we want. I've fallen in that trap plenty of times. I'll probably fall in it again, but not this time. Show me what you're going to do. Explain the policy stance. Making a lofty promise is amazing, but actions, they speak much louder than words do. Throw it in the chat. What do you guys think? I've been very adamant and very loud spoken about this fact that I don't necessarily buy a lot of the politicians who've been promising us a lot of things. I know that Cynthia Loomis is one of the few that I genuinely believe and trust as far as what she's doing, what she's saying, what she wants to execute on. Someone like Ted Cruz, I don't buy it. He jumps on every single bandwagon that he thinks will get him a few extra votes here or there. I mean, look, if you're the type of man who will literally take it on the chin from another man calling your wife ugly after you have repeatedly insulted him and then cozy up next to him, you just sound like a spineless little twat to me. Why do I think that a spineless little twat is going to help save Bitcoin? I don't. I frankly don't. But hey, that's just my 2 cents. Throw it in the chat if you don't agree. I'm open to hearing what you have to say.
What's up, Q? We're still waiting for John. Excited to have him. We did the first Sats drop. I hope, I think D348 got it. So congrats to you for getting it, man. I guess anything else you want to talk on right now, Q?
Let's stay on the politic bandwagon, because when John shows up, I want to be focused a lot more on just price action and bear market stuff. And that's going to be the brunt of our conversation, I think, with him. But I'd love to explore some of the various political things that I brought up between Saudi Arabia and China aligning for a potential petro yuan, down to talk about this House hearing or House session, however much substance is actually coming out of there remains to be seen, or even diving into just like this broader conversation, and we can start a little bit of dialogue there. I'll let you pick.
Yeah, let's start with the Saudi Arabia and Chinese thing. There's a couple interesting things. I know Guy Swan was narrating an article that was put up by Mike Hobart on Bitcoin Magazine, and it was kind of describing the game theory of exactly what you're talking about. China, using the basically buying Saudi Arabia's oil with the digital yuan or the yuan, as well as Russia is kind of in an interesting point where it's like, we're trying to sanction them, but the harder the US sanctions them, the more it hurts Europe, which is our allies. Germany is kind of like known as the manufacturing hub for Europe, and they turned off a lot of their nuclear reactors. We think it was kind of a dumb idea in order to do that, turning off the nuclear reactors. I was reading an article saying it was for safety concerns. Well, my counter arguments, if you've got this multi-billion or multiple $1 million facility for nuclear, why don't you just upgrade the safety and reliability of the facility instead of just completely decommissioning it? because now you're having the issue with energy prices rising. Q, I know you were saying that Russia sanctioned Biden and his family and a bunch of other U.S. politicians. I believe it was Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, obviously Hillary Clinton was among the list. And then also Blinken, I forget Blinken's first name as well. I think is he Secretary of Defense? I forget who he is, but basically he had sanctions for a bunch of U.S. politicians. I'm not sure what that quite means. I guess they shouldn't be caught in Russia at all during this time. I don't know why anyone would want to be there right now, especially if you're a U.S. citizen. I think it's just kind of dangerous. But yeah, it's very interesting. And I guess if there's anything else you want to add to that, Q.
Yeah, I mean, look, on the Russia sanctioning the Bidens, I mean, Hillary Clinton was on the list of people being sanctioned. Like, this is more, I think, ceremonial than it is substantive. Sorry, I keep trying to use big words when I ought not to. But look, when Trump put Iran back on sanctions by ripping up the nuclear deal about 4 years ago now, 5 years ago, Iran responded by putting Trump on sanctions. Like when the US put the Iranian National Guard as a terrorist organization, Iran responded by putting the US military as a military or as a terrorist, or listing them as a terrorist organization. So this is very much, that is so fucking funny. I want to say this now, and I'm going to say it again when John comes on. So John Vallis, who is going to be our guest today, does not recognize daylight savings.
No, it's where he's living. He's not in Canada. He's Canadian, but he's kind of like a digital nomad right now. So the place where he was, his calendar didn't update because the place where he is doesn't have daylight savings or anything.
That's truly remarkable. Daylight savings is also stupid.
I agree.
So stupid. But hey, I also appreciate the fact that it was created by farmers way back when it was necessary. However, based on some conversations that I've had with select farmers at this point, a lot of them agree that technology is advanced enough to where they don't require it. It's unnecessary. This is the perfect example of how things that politicians promise us to be transitory, like inflation, are not actually transitory, because they ultimately just last forever because no one forgets to turn it off when we're done with it. Sorry, got a little aggressive there.
You bring up a great point, Q. So I know Senator Loomis was trying to put a revision in one of the upcoming bills to have that it prevents people from being taxed on things that are under $600. So like, if you're buying a cup of coffee or a hamburger or whatever with Bitcoin, whether it's on the Lightning Network or on chain, you will not be taxed for those transactions. It's not gone onto the floor. It's not been introduced. So it's I'm going to expect that it might get struck down. I will remain optimistic that it won't, but very realistically, it'll be kind of like one of those things that's like, oh, this has got to go if this stays in, how the whole political scene is. But I brought up a point. I was like, Senator Loomis, like, I really appreciate what you're doing, but why don't we make it a SAT limit? So like 2 million sats per se, that's around $720. So that way, as the currency's hyperinflating, Bitcoin's price is appreciating, you can get more bang for your buck because it's deflationary currency. And I made the joke that hamburgers and a cup of coffee, like you stated, that shouldn't be taxed. In short enough order, with inflation running hot right now, it's not long before a cup of coffee or a hamburger does cost $600 US. Q, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Sorry, I was trying to do the shortcut with my keyboard. But yeah, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. There's a degree of this where it's like that $600 today might sound like, hey, that's a feasible amount. 10 years from now, $600 is very much what you could be paying for McDonald's. Like, let's be real. McDonald's at one point cost 5 cents.
Yeah.
Right now, it's going to cost you what? $3 for a Big Mac?
Yeah. And even to your point, Q,
that's a 60-time increase. All right.
Yeah. And to your point, Q, like it seems like a great idea when they said the limits for bank transfers was $10,000. I forget when that went in. I think that was in the 70s or 60s. That they would track transactions of $10,000 or more. You have to report to the IRS. But now that same $10,000 back in the 70s, I believe, is now worth like $68,000 or almost $70,000. So as your currency is hyperinflating, that means that you need to track more transactions because your dollars are becoming less and less valuable.
I want to also quickly touch on this because it was announced today. The producer price index, which essentially measures how much producers, manufacturers are paying to create the goods and services that you and I are buying from them. Their inflation rate is coming in at about 10%. So if they're saying that theirs is 10%, but then they're trying to tell us, the government, that the CPI, consumer price index, is only up about 7.5, 7.8, I believe was the last reading. I call big load of bullshit on that. Like,
Yep.
you can manipulate numbers. I'm a data analyst. Let me tell you, I can make any number look the way you want it to look. You give me enough data, I can play with it and show you that you have a higher than 50% retention rate. I can. That's how numbers work. That's how data analysis works. You can find it if you create it. They are manipulating these numbers. Inflation is already above 10%. Whether we want to accept that fact or not, most of us listening, most of us watching, we know that to be true. It's about making sure that our friends and family know that as well, because it's lonely on the top. It is. And we don't want to live alone. That's just my 2 cents, though. Chris is sitting there chomping at the bits, ready to live alone in his lake house.
Yeah, it's pretty great. I'm not gonna lie. I'm always down to have people visit though. I think John just got here, Q. So if you want to we'll cut to a quick commercial break. We'll get all set up and then we'll bring John Vallis on and we'll have a good chat with him. So we'll talk to you in a few minutes, guys.
Code YTMAG, get 10% off your conference tickets. You know the drill, guys.
We're back.
What is up, guys? Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for watching yet another Sound Money Fest commercial. I'm so hyped for Sound Money Fest. I'm so excited for that. If you have not got your tickets, if all you can do is come on a Saturday, if you can't take Wednesday through Friday off, fine. Tickets to Sound Money Fest are available on their own. You can still use code YTMAG. You're going to want to come party. We're going to be partying nonstop. John, are you excited to party for Sound Money Fest?
I'm not a big partier anymore, but you know, if the atmosphere is super special, then I'll let myself do it. And I can't think of a more special atmosphere than a bunch of Bitcoiners getting together at the conference and then afterwards letting off some steam. So it may be one of those rare occasions where I, let things get a little looser than normal and suffer the consequences the next day, but it may be worth it. So I'm definitely going to be
tomorrow's part. That'll be tomorrow's problem. But in the meantime, we are now joined by our guest today. As you have seen, John Vallis. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry that daylight savings time still exists. May this be a lesson to us all to not buy when politicians say something is transitory.
Yeah,
How
well,
you doing
that's my
today, John?
bad. So I'm doing great, man. I'm happy to be hanging out with you guys. That's my bad on the daily daylight savings time front, but it seems like a fiat thing that needs to go by the wayside when we go into to hyper Bitcoinization. So, anyways, we're
We're
here
adding
now.
it to the ongoing list of what does Bitcoin fix. Daylight savings
Right.
time has now been added. You heard it here
Yeah.
first on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I'm so
Amen.
sorry that my voice burns your ears, Nikki. More power. Deal with it because I lost my voice at a wedding over the weekend. So, John,
I thought,
no, sorry, go
go
ahead.
for it. No, you go. You go.
John, as we talked about a little bit before we hopped on, I am of the notion that we have entered a Bitcoin bear market. We are way too far off from the highs. We have not made a new low, which I think is a positive sign, or at least a short-term low. However, I don't see us making a new high, at least for a couple of years, not until the next halving. I don't know if you feel the same that we're in a Bitcoin bear market or not, but would love your thoughts.
Sure. I guess I first had this, like, I love bear markets. NGU is great and everyone loves their wealth going up. And I understand that it's a part of the adoption, and the more hype, the more people get brought in. But it is like a good period for things to be cleansed, right? Like all the trash has to be cleansed out of the system that came along with the last hype cycle. And I remember back in the lows of 2015, and things just get nice and quiet, right? Like the hardcore stick around, and the hype people leave for a little while. So I tend to like bear markets. As for whether or not we're in one now, I don't know. I mean, we're in really uncharted waters, it seems, in the global macro and geopolitical situation. It's so hard for me to imagine that we wouldn't hit another high before the next halving, just because there's so many reasons for the value proposition of Bitcoin is so obvious, and becomes more obvious with each passing day. But Bitcoin is still a relatively small drop in a large global financial and monetary bucket. And so, like, do the winds that blow in those domains just by necessity have like a big impact on Bitcoin? The answer is probably still yes. So I wouldn't be surprised if, and generally speaking, price talk is the least fascinating or interesting thing for me in Bitcoin, but I wouldn't be surprised if the macro situation meant that we kept chopping down for another 6 to 12 months. I think we probably will hit another high before the next halving, because I just think a lot of questions will be resolved by that time. And yeah, I think a lot of new interest will by necessity be coming into the space. But I'm like a low, I cheerlead every time the price drops, right? Because I think we're all in that boat. Like, if you think something is inevitable, you want to scoop it up on the cheap. And so, like, I always root for price drops, and I kind of lament price pumps. But at the same time, to what degree does Bitcoin doing its thing sooner help save more people and help mitigate some of the stress and tumult that's going to come from transitioning from fiat to a Bitcoin system? And so in that sense, like, maybe it's better that things happen quickly. At the end of the day, it's not under any of our control, right? So, but if the question is like, will we hit a new high before the next halving? I think we probably will, but I wouldn't be disappointed at all if we didn't.
There are a couple of things I want to unpack there. I want to discuss in a little bit sort of what we think could be the catalyst to reach these new highs. I think we're on the same page that it'll be more something to do with like a country adopting or another business adopting Bitcoin on their balance sheets. But I want to first unpack what you were saying about getting the bad out of here during the bear market. I think very famously during the 2018 bear market, the ICO craze really got killed. Every single company introduced an ICO, and by the end of that bear market, it was very much like a taboo topic all of a sudden if you were going to have an ICO. I personally feel like this present market's ICO is the NFT craze that we're seeing going on right now. Do you find any similarities between the two? And could you maybe talk a little bit on what were some of the catalysts that really helped people get away from the ICO craze? Because we do still have altcoins, they still exist, but not to the degree in which we saw them 4 or 5 years ago.
I totally agree. I mean, I remember back then, it was just like you throw up a fancy website with a couple pictures of your influencer advisors and a white paper that nobody's going to read anyways, nor can anyone understand. And then, you raise 50 million in 24 hours off the back of that. And we're seeing the same kind of like irrational exuberance and, ridiculous valuations in the NFT space. And also a lot of those ICOs came back to life. I mean, I think part of the answer of what cleared it out was that Bitcoin pumped first in early 2019. Like it came out of the late 2018 lows and ripped like to whatever it was, 14K or something during that period. And a lot of the older ICOs just stayed like dead. And I think this one brought in a lot of like Bitcoin maxis to see that Bitcoin was the actual thing. But I also think a lot of them thought that was the end of the road for a lot of those ICO tokens. But, we live in such a clown world that they ended up pumping super hard over the last, whatever it is, 12 months. And then we have the emergence of these NFTs. And what always I find difficult to understand is like what I think the value prop for Bitcoin is like so easy and clear. It's like, clearly the monetary system. And even if you don't understand all the nuance, it's like, if you believe the value prop is possible, i.e. a replacement for the current monetary system, that's a dramatic upgrade, and how influential that is on so many different areas of economics and politics and life generally, like that's a big thing, even if you don't get how it all works. But somehow someone's saying like, hey, this is a token that's putting bananas on the blockchain, it's going to revolutionize supply chains, or hey, this is like an NFT for trading, like the narrative is, even if you believe in it, it's so inconsequential, at least relative to what the value proposition is for Bitcoin. But maybe that's like the simplicity of it maybe just draws people in. And of course, we live in such a high time preference world that people are really attracted to the prospect of like sick gains in the next week, like I want 100x in the next 4 weeks or something like that. And you hear the stories of that happening to a select few, or supposedly having happened. And then it draws people in. And I think it's indicative of the times we're in, that people are, one, so greedy and high time preference. And the flip side of that, or like, compounding that, is that there's such a sense of deprivation and hopelessness. People are looking out on the world and looking at their lives, and there's a lack of meaning and there's a lack of hope for the future. And you just grasp at any way that you think might be able to pull you out of that. And you get sucked in by these narratives of like, well, just buy this NFT or buy this token, and 6 months from now, you're taking private jets and driving Lambos and everything is fixed. And like, even if that were the case, I mean, I think we all can appreciate that wouldn't fix the meaning problem that you may be having. And it certainly doesn't fix anything in the culture that's generating that issue. But, people don't want to do the work. They don't want to have someone sit them down and say, hey, this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to require big shifts, both in the world exterior and in your world interior. And you've got to reframe how you think about some things, and you got to reframe how you take responsibility for things, and you got to lower your expectations, or at least extend the time horizon on which you're imposing them. And that's not a sexy pitch in an environment that is so hype driven and low and high time preference. And like I said, I think a lot of people in the world today are hurting, and maybe they don't even recognize that they haven't put their finger on exactly why, but a lot of people feel that angst and that anxiety and that nihilism and that, lack of hope for the future. And I think they think the quickest way out of it is just to, get theirs as quickly as possible and drown themselves in, fiat extravagance as a means of filling up those concerns or that hole. And I think a lot of us in the Bitcoin space realize that that's definitely not the way to do it. And I think the culture of this space is increasingly revealing that. And why it's so appealing at drawing people in is because you once you start to see things differently, well, you have a lot more questions. You're like, okay, I get like that we may be revamping the global monetary order. What does that mean then in terms of how I should be orienting my life and what I should be striving for? And how do I discover or generate or channel meaning in my life anew, because I've never had this degree of freedom or sovereignty and that kind of stuff. And these are the conversations we have in this space, because we're all in a completely novel situation now vis-a-vis our degree of freedom over our finances. And as we accumulate more of that, and as our image of the future becomes shaped by that freedom, a lot of new questions like bubble up about how we should live our lives. And I love how these are the type of discussions that we have in this space. It's not about Lambos, it's about, health and philosophy and economics and, all that good stuff that helps you orient yourself properly in the world.
Definitely. I think even to your point, like I'd say a lot of Bitcoiners are kind of students of history. And when you look at it, like the 2017 ICO craze, I would call it very similar to the internet, when the .com bust, when everyone was saying, oh, we're an Internet of Things company. And, their stock price, exactly like you said, exorbitant evaluations, they're getting money thrown at them in the form of stocks or even just people giving them loans for whatever reason. Obviously, that just kind of washes out. I think clown world's only gotten worse, and people are obviously like pushing themselves off the risk curve. That's why they deviate from Bitcoin, or, they're just looking at these high flyer stocks like such as GameStop or AMC in order to beat that. And then now you even have Nancy Pelosi saying all the money we're printing isn't causing harm to the American economy and inflation. It's just we're actually paying back our debts with creating more debt. If that doesn't seem like the biggest Ponzi scheme ever, I don't know what is. But John, I guess let me form my question. I think while I'm excited about Bitcoin's adoption, what it is, freedom money, and it gives you sovereignty over yourself and your money and finances, we've had two, I'd say, very quick successions of like examples in the real world of this happening. Just look at the Canadian Freedom Convoy with a lot of the truckers getting their finances, insurance, various things shut off from them. And obviously, I don't want to say we botched it. I think it was very successful, like distributing Bitcoin, but we didn't realize how quickly the government was going to try and hinder not just Bitcoin, the network, which they can't, but the people that use it. They know the names, or they saw the faces of the truckers, or even Nobody Caribou, that they were going after him. They showed up at his house. Like, very much the people that use Bitcoin are the risk, not the protocol itself. But then even a more recent example is Ukraine and Russia. This is horrible to say, but it was kind of more comforting seeing that even out of a bad situation, Bitcoin was able to help Ukrainians that were fleeing take their wealth. Like we said, God forbid you're under authoritarian regime or war is going on, you can take your wealth in Bitcoin and leave and not lose. Yeah, you lost your house or your home or where you live in your family and community, but at the same time, you're able to store your wealth either in your mind or on some type of device and bring it across the border until you're safe. Whereas also we're seeing the flip side, the Russians, many of the Russian people, I assume, didn't want this war, or they were lied to through Putin and his propaganda campaign of saying they need to liberate Ukraine. But at the same time, they're the ones being harmed the most by all these swift sanctions. Yeah, it does harm Putin, kind of, but when you're that powerful, I mean, what's a few billion or trillion or whatever his net worth is, it's really hard to decipher, but it's definitely hurting people on the ground as we're watching in real time the Russian ruble hyperinflate. So I guess my question to you after that long-winded rant is, I feel like while Bitcoin is being adopted at a rapid rate, why do you think people are not seeing all these things and being like, oh, maybe I should get some, or maybe I should get off zero and kind of start learning about it? I feel like still in normie land, when I talk to people, they're like, oh, what's Bitcoin? I've heard about it. It seems like a scam, or, they still conflate it to 2017. Why would that be?
That's the 21 million Bitcoin question, right? I mean, if I knew that, maybe I'd be more effective at spreading the good word. But because I share that sentiment, like, I think all of it, it's binary, right? Like, you see it or you don't see it. And once you see it, you very quickly have all your net worth wrapped up in Bitcoin, and your job is Bitcoin, and your thoughts are Bitcoin, and all the conversations are Bitcoin. But prior to that, it doesn't even exist. You have blinders on, and if they're pointed this way, if your perspective is and orientation is this way, you can't really see what's outside, what's outside the Overton window, as they say. And so I don't know what keeps people from. I mean, necessity is always the one that pushes people to stuff like this, right? So, like, most people in relatively stable countries have never felt the necessity. Like, even if you're someone in China, and there's capital controls and stuff like that, but most of your life is transacted in yuan, and there's a ton of opportunity to make money, and you can travel and spend money easily enough. And okay, maybe you can only send out 50 grand a year, officially or whatever. But one, if you're rich, you've probably found other ways around that by setting up shell companies and this and that. And if you're not, it's not an issue for you. So, but if you're in Ukraine right now, if you're in Russia, if you're in Yemen, Syria, like all these places where there's people are asking the question, shit, like I need to move. How do I take my wealth with me in a safe way? And the ATM is not giving me my money, and my gold is confiscated at the border. Well, then you start to Google how to move money across borders, or what's a safe way to secure your wealth. And maybe that's how people come upon Bitcoin. And there's a huge incentive to learn about it and adopt it and that kind of thing, but for those of us who are relatively, if you're a normie in a relatively stable country, just think about how, as we watch Clown World, and you mentioned Pelosi and Biden and all this stuff, like, that meme with the frog, like just lying on his deathbed and it says dies of cringe. Like, I feel like that every day. Like, I saw that recent video from Pelosi, and I kind of like look around, like, where the fuck am I? Like, what reality am I in that this person speaking is like one of the top politicians in the most powerful country in the world, and this type of rhetoric is accepted? Like, there's no pushback whatsoever, at least within the mainstream discourse, on this type of rhetoric. It's just completely mind-blowing to me. And so you have to appreciate that at least a certain demographic or cohort of the population is receptive to that type of rhetoric. And so I think them thinking how corrupted and how disordered and perverted the system is not very top of mind for them, and COVID kind of laid that bare for a lot of people. Like, depending on kind of what side you fell on that issue, you could kind of tell, were people extremely trusting of the government and the media and big business, or were they starting to develop a distrust and maybe question some things and look back through history and find a lot of just cause to question those institutions? And so I think, as is always the case, people will get Bitcoin, they'll buy Bitcoin at the price they deserve, and they'll look into it when they're ready. And like us all, they'll probably look back and be like, geez, I wish I had paid attention sooner. But I think this is just a slow grind, and maybe recent events, and I hope things don't worsen. But in my kind of base case for how this transition takes place, I think things probably do worsen in many different ways and in unpredictable ways to come. That's going to be the impetus for a lot of interest to fall on Bitcoin, and people will have to sort it out if they want to make sure their future is secure, or even have a chance at it. Because as you say, like, what happened in Canada, and I'm sure a lot of people were shocked that, like, wow, in a place like Canada, something, people's bank accounts could be frozen and money could be cut off without, trial or anything. Just, hey, you're involved in a protest that we deem unacceptable, and therefore we're going to shut off access to your wealth. Maybe we're going to revoke your trucking license. Maybe we're going to get you fired, all this kind of stuff. And of course, the vax mandate issue over the last 2 years has been a part of that too. I think that's been a wake-up call for people, but still, for a lot of people, Bitcoin isn't on their radar. And then you have to sift through so much fucking noise, man. Like, I've talked to some of these people in Canada, and crypto and Bitcoin are synonymous for a lot of people. And so people don't know how to sift through all the noise to land on, what's actually legit and engage it properly. And then the final piece I'll say is, as you mentioned about what happened up in Canada, and it seems like Nobody Caribou was raided in some capacity, or something was confiscated. It shows that, as you said, the protocol is ironclad, but interacting with it has its risks and different considerations. And this is a learning process for us all. Like, we need to figure out best practices, not only for custodying our own Bitcoin and transacting privately, but how do we support causes that are important to us in a way that protects us and protects the recipients of those funds? And what is the best way to distribute funds in those circumstances. And there's going to be a lot of attack vectors, I guess, and I think a lot of us are going to mature very much in the next few years, and probably put on, like, even though we've always claimed to be kind of adversarial thinkers, we were probably just more so like disagreeable and anti-establishment. But now I think, we're going to develop a far more adversarial mindset vis-a-vis interacting with this system in a way that is safe and secure for us and those people that we're interacting with.
Yeah, I think an important thing also that I do want to repeat for those who've been listening to the show, what we talk about a lot, the issues going on in Ukraine and Russia, the lack of access to your own funds just north of the border in Canada. This happened in America, in Atlanta last week. A very prominent African-American director was not granted access to his bank account and was arrested for trying to withdraw $12,000 worth of cash. So this feeds into the narrative of Bitcoin solves this. However, I think there is also a second layer to this sort of question where shout out to our colleague Mills, who I think does an excellent job when she has these types of one-on-one conversations of understanding what your values are. What is your priority with your money? Do you want to save it for your future children? Are you trying to be able to quickly access and transact it on a regular enough basis, but money that's not losing value overnight? Or is it somewhere in between the spectrum? Or is it even beyond that? And I think understanding that helps people to dive into Bitcoin in the facet that they like or need. One thing that I tend to notice, though, both with new people within the Bitcoin space, as well as just people who are anti-Bitcoin, not involved in Bitcoin, whether it's their fiat stooges or their diehard shitcoiner, I've never been convinced that their definition of money is something that I buy into. Most of them can't really define money. And I think that is that first step for any and all Bitcoiners down that rabbit hole, when you start to define what is money, and then you start to evaluate it to your own necessities and your own needs. And then you see where Bitcoin fits into that equation. John, I'd love to hear from you. How did that happen for you? How did you first learn about Bitcoin and yourself buy into, hey, this aspect of Bitcoin is what I like and what I want to get involved in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And I think probably our mutual friend, Breedlove, his whole show is What is Money? Because as you start to ask yourself that question, what is money? What does it mean to you? You realize it's not such a simple question to answer. There's a lot wrapped up in it. My own journey, I had been, for lack of a better term, like kind of a contrarian or anti-establishment sort of thinker for pretty much my whole life. I don't know where the curiosity came from, but when I was a young kid, I read a lot. I just got my hands on anything I could, and all nonfiction. Like just like many of us, I think, wanted to try to understand the world, and didn't feel like I was getting that from normal school and the conversations and stuff with my peers. So I just didn't matter if it was history or economics or anything really, just trying to piece together the world. And, I started to, when I was, a young teenager, I just wanted to be rich, right? Because I guess that means you have as ultimate optionality. You can do what you want with your life, and that's ultimate freedom, right? And so that's what I wanted. And I thought the best way to make money was to manage money, be a stockbroker or wealth management or something like that. And so I read and studied a lot about that, and read all the classic books, and basically wanted to go into that line of work when I started my career. And I did for 3 years. I was in Shanghai and Beijing doing wealth management. And, long story short, really hated that. Didn't like the work, sleazy, douchey, just everything bad about everything we know that's bad about fiat finance. And, but all the while, as I was going through that, I started to learn about the monetary system and central banking and that kind of stuff. And realized it was, basically all a fraud, just a giant fraud being perpetuated on the world that almost nobody seemed to know about, and the people that did know about it and were speaking up were obviously maligned and considered conspiracy theorists and all the rest of it. And my response to that was just to become like pretty much a closet gold bug. And it's not a very, there was no other options at the time, right? And all the people that were talking about these issues were gold bugs. And the thesis was something like, this is unsustainable. It's going to come crashing down at some point. You better have some gold. And even though, like, if you really play that out, it doesn't make much sense. Like, if we get that degree of like collapse and gold shoots to the moon, like even your tenth of an ounce, like little gold pieces, you're not going to be able to go to the grocery store and buy stuff with that. And, you know, as we all often say now, like ammo would probably be a better medium of exchange in this sort of apocalyptic environment. But what are you going to do, right? There was nothing else to do about it. And then when Bitcoin, and so kind of very commonly with those gold bug types, they're very libertarian, very anti-big government, and you know, like, and that was always me, right? I thought people should be able to take the drugs they want to take. They should be able to do what they want to do as long as they're not harming or imposing upon other people. And then Bitcoin came around on my radar, I think in like 2012 or 13. I started seeing some Andreas videos on YouTube and just was struck by how he spoke about Bitcoin. Like at the time, I couldn't, when he got into technical details, you know, I wasn't up to speed on that kind of stuff yet, but it's pretty easy to tell when someone's being honest and genuine, especially in an environment where so few people are. And you could just tell, like, this person, one, is genuinely passionate about this and cares about it, and doesn't seem to have a big ulterior motive, and seems to be just sincerely speaking about something they think is very meaningful. And so that's what kind of led me to continue listening and find other resources. And then, you know, like others, well, actually, I wanted to buy, my friend and I wanted to buy DMT on the Silk Road because, you know, we've been longtime psychonauts, and we realized you had to get Bitcoin, but at the time it was super hard, and we weren't so sure about sending DMT to our, you know, our mailing address. So we pushed out. And then on a trip to Bali, I think in 2014, there was a physical store there. And that's when I picked up my first little bit of Bitcoin. And of course, once you have skin in the game, you start paying more attention and you go down the rabbit hole. And basically, it's been a accelerating journey since, whereas, you know, it started off as being critical of the monetary system and all the deleterious side effects that has you know, culturally and economically and geopolitically, to now, you know, speculating on the relationship between money and God. You know, that's how far things have come on that journey. So it's been interesting to say the least, but that's the Coles Notes version of my rabbit hole story.
I love that. I funny enough, actually was trying to buy pot on Silk Road. And again, I didn't buy into this whole Bitcoin thing. I was like, what is this? Nope. That was genuinely why I didn't go down the Silk Road path. And I still kick myself over the head for that one.
Yeah.
You know, there's a conversation happening right now in our chat that I'd love to bring out live onto this right now. A debate on the merits of using Bitcoin with the marijuana industry. There are some valid arguments for it. You know, the marijuana industry in America specifically is still federally illegal. Therefore, they're not granted access to banks' loans. It's very difficult for them to even accept, or not difficult, they can't accept like credit cards or payment processors like that, again, because it's federally illegal. There have been issues with a lot of these dispensaries just holding vaults full of cash, unable to even deposit it into a bank because, again, you're not allowed banking access because it is federally illegal. Enter Bitcoin. It seems like it would solve this problem very quickly and easily for these types of businesses. I am of the notion, however, that I actually think, as a very heavy weed smoker, as some of you may tell from my voice, I don't think that actually helps Bitcoin in the long run. I think it helps the marijuana industry, but I think when you have these senile politicians who can barely wrap their minds around Bitcoin and money, and then we're trying to convince them at the same time, hey, let's legalize pot because you've legalized God knows how many drugs that go through the pharmaceutical system, all the alcohol that everyone consumes in this country, all the nicotine in cigarettes and vapes that you allow us to consume. Marijuana will slowly and surely be legalized as well. I worry, though, if those two cross paths, there are two issues. One being you feed into that whole, hey, Bitcoin's used by drug dealers, Bitcoin's being used by the marijuana industry, marijuana is a drug, yada, yada, yada. I don't believe marijuana is a drug. I don't believe that Bitcoin is used by any sort of illicit activity more than the US dollar is. But then the second issue I have, which is the bigger one, Again, you see now politicians are having a hard enough time wrapping their mind around Bitcoin. I don't need them to worry about how Bitcoin is going to be used in the marijuana industry and then carve out certain caveats for that. I'd love your thoughts, if you have any, on just that intersectionality.
Yeah, my thoughts are we don't get to control how Bitcoin gets used and for what and how adoption ultimately takes place, right? Because we kind of think like, oh, we know the value prop of Bitcoin. It's, it's sound money. Then you can transact with anyone you like, and you can do so privately fairly privately or very privately, depending on how you acquired it and how you transact with it and that kind of stuff. And therefore it should kind of like, this should be the process by which adoption happens. But I mean, there's so many factors at play that I think individuals should decide for themselves how they want to use this. I don't pretend to have any authority to impose how people should understand Bitcoin and what the narrative around it should be, or to think like, oh, like if we can avoid this problem here, then that would be good for adoption and we can get faster to the next stage. Like this is, Pandora's box has been opened. Basically, this thing's out in the wild now, and it's just going to put its roots all through things and innovate things in the way that it does. And if it survives and if we steward it properly, then I think in the end, we will, arrive at that place that we often talk about, that hyper Bitcoinized world. And a lot of things will be different there. But so like, obviously money is so integral to pretty much everything that it's got to come and bump up against so many things that are basically antithetical to it. And that, if that can be a daunting thing, because you're like, oh my God, everywhere it tries to go, because it's antithetical to those things, it's going to be perceived as like evil, basically, because it's so opposite to things. And so I think, the process is going to be really messy, where people figure out how to use it for their needs. And in this particular case, like if there's more restrictions placed on them, like how and what kind of a solution does Bitcoin represent for those people with those particular issues? So I guess my answer is not a great one, but I just don't concern myself with perception and politics and narrative around Bitcoin. I think it is a certain thing, and people have the ability and will use it however they please. And it'll be messy, and all sorts of mistakes will be made along the way. But I think ultimately, if we're right about this, it'll wind up where we think it's going to wind up. I mean, this is kind of a tangential example, so it's not maybe it's not applicable, but even something like El Salvador being the first to make it legal tender, because like prior to that, we're all thinking like central banks will start making an allocation just as a hedge against the system that they steward. I don't think any of us were thinking like someone would come out and be so, make it legal tender and make it kind of like the primary component of their platform, building Bitcoin City and Bitcoin bonds and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's many surprises to come, but so I think the best way to approach all the unknowns and all the challenges to come is for individuals to be equipped with the best knowledge available to transact for their needs in the most secure and private way possible. And if people take that responsibility upon themselves, then hopefully they can insulate themselves from some of that turbulence and those challenges. And then, because I often think about it in terms of, if Bitcoin really is immutable, right? If it's the unchanging thing, then anything else that it comes up against relative to it is changeable, is mutable. And so like, as Bitcoin integrates into the current socioeconomic and political dynamic or apparatus as it exists today, it's necessarily going to slowly form it to its own shape, right? But that apparatus itself thinks it's the thing that things conform to. So it wants to, take Bitcoin and make it conform to it, right? But it doesn't, like, so the question is like, which one is the most unchangeable? And I think we would all agree that it's Bitcoin. And so that, the political apparatus is going to have to come to grips, probably slowly and painfully and with great resistance, that they're the thing that has to start to mold and conform to the different, principles and values and characteristics of Bitcoin. And they're not going to like that, because, that apparatus likes being the big dog on the block and having all the power and making all the rules. And now they're coming up against something that they can't control. And the process of them realizing that and those systems conforming more closely to the attributes of Bitcoin is probably going to be, there's going to be some friction there.
John, I'm going to toss a question that we asked Samson Mao yesterday. So to your point with El Salvador adopting Bitcoin, I think it kind of shocked many of us. I know I wasn't able to make Bitcoin 2021, but it was exhilarating watching it on Twitter, Jack Maller's speech. And I definitely welled up with some tears watching it, how passionate he was and how excited, like what we said was always going to happen actually happened last summer. But with that being said, I guess while El Salvador adopted it, I always thought, and talking about bear markets, what about politicians, whether they're US or abroad, that opt to say we should adopt Bitcoin, and then ultimately a bear market ensues and crashes, with the hype cycles of it going up exponentially and then crashing. Obviously, politicians are very high time preference, where they're trying to just get back in office every 2 years, every 4 years, however long it is. I guess what issues do you see with politicians trying to say, oh, we should make Bitcoin legal tender? And let's just say they make it legal tender right at the top and then it crashes. And then obviously the political opponents are going to say, look, we lost 50% of our value, 70% of our value, whatever it may be, and say this is a bad idea and either ban it or try and hinder its adoption. I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I shared, even though you weren't there in person, I certainly had a similar reaction. I was backstage at the time, and Jack made the announcement, and a bunch of us were standing around, and he came off and went into like the little green room, and the bathroom is connected to it. And I was in the bathroom at the time, and I came out, and it was just Jack there with his head in his hands crying right before his family and everyone came in. And so, I was crying too. I gave him a big hug. Everyone filed in, everyone was crying. So it was definitely a special moment. But to your point, a lot of political careers are probably going to be destroyed in the process of this thing monetizing and becoming dominant global money, because politicians, as you said, are so high time preference, and their constituents are often the same way. I mean, just look at, I hate to shit on normie land too much, because everyone, I think, is capable of making rational and logical decisions. But of course, we exist in an environment today where it's information wars everywhere. And how do you parse all the information coming at you and all the algorithms working on your consciousness to actually come to some kind of a quote unquote real perception of what's going on? Like, what is objective perception in this day and age? There isn't really. We all have our biases and prejudices and conditioning, but I think a lot of us attempt to see things as clearly as we can so that we can orient ourselves to the most truthful perspective that we can. But a lot of people are very reflexive in how they respond to all this information. Again, like 2 examples happening right now, the COVID stuff and the Russia-Ukraine stuff. And I don't know what's going on. I know that almost certainly the situation is more complex than we're led to believe or we're told, but basically in the dynamic that exists today, it's like, there's a binary option. Like, is it bad or is it good? Is this the evil or the victim? And in the case of Bitcoin, it's like, did the politician that fought for Bitcoin legal tender or to get Bitcoin on the balance sheet, is he bad now because Bitcoin crashed, or is he good because Bitcoin's doing well? And decisions get made on those timeframes and in that way. And so long term, I have hope that more people will quote unquote wake up and not be so easily swayed by short-term and overly simplistic narratives. But I think we're in for a bunch of that before all this is said and done. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Bukele is a great example. Like, if Bitcoin crashes and his popularity goes down, and then the next government comes in and they reverse everything he did, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. And I think we'd all be disappointed in that outcome. But I think that's just the ebb and flow about how this is all going to play out. And at the end of the day, like, I'm sure you all realize this, but Bitcoin is black market money, right? That's what it's intended to be. It was never like, even though I think part of its monetization and adoption will include tacit approval of it, like if it's completely subject to that approval, well, then it's already failed. It has to be able to stand on its own feet. It has to be able to succeed without the approval of these institutions of authority and control. And that's a tall order in the world today, because the grip of those institutions is so strong and so all encompassing. And that's why I think like it's not just the case, well, oh, Bitcoin's here now and all that stuff will go away. That grip has to be poked at and loosened, and like through the course of time, slowly, as those institutions, perhaps largely because of the economy that's happening within Bitcoin, and the seigniorage and the rent seeking that's being removed from those institutions, and as a result their grip becomes less powerful. But that's going to take some time. And but the point is I love all these well, I don't love it, but like I'm pretty jazzed about the El Salvador situation, right? And that came because of the political apparatus making a decision. But again, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is fuck you money, and it's fuck you to institutions that would seek to control it. And if it can't function ultimately that way, if it can't resist the encroachments of those institutions of control, then it's not what we think it is. So, I guess that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with the idea that it's fuck you money, especially when you stop for a moment and think, like, what is the main money source, or what is the main type of money in the world today? And that's the US dollar. And those countries that have been exiled, don't benefit from, or just are not cozied up to the dollar, America, or the printer, they stand to benefit a lot more from adopting Bitcoin at an earlier point. To play a little bit of this political or geopolitical game theory, we're seeing a lot of conversation out of Russia ahead of the Ukraine invasion about them possibly legalizing Bitcoin and going back and forth. It was Putin that made the ultimate declaration saying, we're going to figure this out. We have too much of a competitive advantage to not. Given where we are in the world right now, with Russia slowly but surely getting kicked out of every single situation, minus OPEC, because they are the largest cartel in the world, at what point does Russia adopting Bitcoin raise alarm bells here in America, or does it not, in your mind?
No, it probably does. With these self-serving, incompetent politicians and constituents that we've already referred to. I mean, again, it's just such a easy narrative, right? It's like, oh, the evil guy adopted it. It must be evil as a result of that, just by association. And so that's totally a possible narrative. But again, if that narrative is capable of stifling it, then, is it what we thought it was? And maybe that's a bit harsh, like, because this happened, maybe it stifles it for a time, and Bitcoin development and things go a little bit more underground, and the whole political movements in the West, at least, that have been supportive, maybe they, get reined in a little bit, and there's less institutional and authoritative support for it, but it still develops, below the surface. It still percolates. People still are able to adopt it and use it. And then maybe, the geopolitical situation changes and people's opinion change with it, and, on it marches. But it could certainly be the case that happens. And I mean, that was the case. I mean, we keep getting that kind of FUD intermittently, right? As you said right at the beginning, like Bitcoin is used for criminals and drug dealers and all that kind of stuff. It's like Bitcoin, if Bitcoin is freedom money for you, it means it's freedom money for everybody. So if we're going to be in a future where that's the case, how should you judge and interact with people that you disagree with ideologically or behaviorally or whatever, right? Because you're not going to be able to punish them financially. You're not going to be able to raid their country and steal their gold. You're not going to be able to cut them off from the money exchange system like SWIFT. You can do trade sanctions because those are actual goods crossing borders. So that will still be applicable in the future. But, how should we, I mean, how does realpolitik and how does warfare change in a Bitcoin future? And, of course, we like to say that the logic of violence changes as a result of the highest concentration of wealth being in a basically digital form and being not inaccessible, but more easy to secure than physical wealth. And so that changes maybe the incentives to violence. But it's an interesting question how that plays out in the future. But I think when I have conversations about Bitcoin with people, I guess, especially in the uber woke culture we're in today, like people are so used to like, oh, well, now that someone's been condemned by the dominant narrative, what is being imposed on them? Okay, so unvaccinated people are bad people. Okay, so are we firing them now? Is that the solution to this narrative? Or like Russia and them are bad, so we're doing X now? Or, and I'm only using those two because they're top of mind. There's a million different ways that could be applied. And so I'm hoping in the future that people's understanding of Bitcoin is at a minimum that this is rules without a ruler. So if you conform to the rules of the system, your access is on the same basis as anyone else's. And nobody can change that. And I'm sure there'll be lots of bans and restrictions and attempted confiscations and stuff along the way. Like, this is probably going to be pretty messy, right? I mean, I like to keep a fairly optimistic view on things. And that's one of the trickiest things in this time. We're talking about how to ground your perspective in the most truthful way possible, like with as much clarity as possible. And like, I think a lot of us in Bitcoin land can either parse the information that's coming at us and kind of see signal through noise, or recognize when we have to abstain from something. Like, I know the Russia-Ukraine situation has been brewing for a long time. There's a lot more geopolitical details involved in what's happening there. It's not just evil man decides he wants more territory, for his country. There's a lot going on. But and I've read some stuff on it and dug into the history, but I'm still like, don't know enough, don't really have an opinion. And that's, side note, that's not even really permitted in this day and age. Like, in the small talk that happens at, around the water cooler or the dinner table, like, you kind of have to choose a side. So, I think we're pretty good at doing that, Bitcoiners generally speaking. But as to like how to walk the tightrope of like being optimistic and seeing a hopeful future, but bracing and preparing for and not being delusional about what has to happen for this transition to take place, that's a far more difficult one to navigate, because the future is always uncertain, and we see so much hope, and we're so excited by the prospect of this new tool for freedom and liberty in the world. But then we're like, but the world is really far down the other way. And so what's the process of it being like turning around the Titanic, basically? And so, yeah, I mean, I think the last 2 years especially, I mean, you kind of asked me about bear markets at the beginning, like when the COVID crash happened in March, and there was a lot of chatter about all this stuff. I think that woke up a lot of people that have been here for a while. Like, it's fun to just watch number go up as you scroll through Twitter and share memes and stuff like that. But I think we're all starting to understand that this is going to require us to a greater, perhaps, personal transformation than we thought. And some of that will be good, right? There'll be like natural improvements on our lives that maybe we were putting off, but others I think there'll be like we'll all mature a lot through this process. I mean, if we really are participating in one of the most profound transitions in, human collective interaction in history, and I think we are, then I don't think we're going to get out of it being the same person that we came into it with, right? Like, if we really are aligned with these principles that we think Bitcoin represents, like truth and freedom and liberty and sovereignty and responsibility, those are going to be put to the test. We're not just going to be able to pay them lip service and see it through to the bright orange future. I think we are actually going to have to show how much we are actually about that stuff, if we're going to see both this thing, if we're going to steward this thing properly, and of course, more importantly, if we're going to use it properly to create the life that we want to create on the back end of this and contribute to a culture that we think is, worthwhile.
Oh, you're still muted.
I want to share a story that was brought to my attention yesterday that I think is valid off of what you said, John, and then present a broader question, because I think what you're really asking, and the call to action here, is we all need to be critical thinkers about everything that's presented to us. We need to, I think, work out that muscle more and more. Yesterday, I believe, or maybe 2 days ago, the Brooklyn Nets played the New York Knicks in an NBA regular season matchup based on the vaccine mandates in the state of New York versus the vaccine mandates set forward by the NBA. Kyrie Irving, who is arguably one of the best players in the league, unvaccinated, was not allowed and has not been allowed to play for the Nets in home games. Now, this is where it gets a little annoying, in my opinion. Kyrie Irving, not listed as playing in the game. He was able to purchase a ticket courtside, show up to the game without a mask, say hi to his teammates and friends, and even dap up and give a hug to Kevin Durant. So at what point, I'm genuinely flabbergasted at this point of what are we saying, that it's the ball? The ball is the medium of what is sending COVID back and forth to people? Like, come on, Adam Silver, this is me calling you out because you've been one of the best commissioners in this new iteration with the Rob Manfeld and the, oh my God, I can't think of the asshole who runs the NFL.
Roger Goodell.
Thank you. You are, in my opinion, like there's no one close to you. You have managed and run the NBA so well, except in this moment right now. And I think it goes back to this idea of you're not thinking critically about the issues at hand and what we can do to, I think, create a different system. We don't have to adhere to the system that's been created or set forward by anyone. You are a private entity, a private business. You can operate as you see fit. So my question then to you, John, is how do we practice that? How do we ask our friends and family to be critical thinkers in everything? Because I think that's what it comes down to is if you're not thinking critically about one thing, you slowly allow yourself to just buy into the narrative of everything else, because it's easier to just be told what to think and what to do than it is to pause, digest, and think about what do I need to do that's best for my family and adheres to the values that I live by.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. A quote comes to mind, which I'm going to butcher here. And it's a bit, I mean, it assumes that we are the ones thinking critically here, which I think a lot of people would take issue with, right? Like the people that you're referring to would be like, no, I'm the critical thinker here. There's a genuine emergency and we need to do everything we can, if it saves one life, blah, blah, blah. So you're not the critical thinker and you're not the compassionate person. And so this is part of the divide, right? But the quote that comes to mind is like, I don't think our job is to wake up the sheep. It's to wake the sleeping lions. It goes something like that, right? And so I think we're going to waste a lot of resources and breath and stuff if we try to get into all these confrontations with people that think so oppositely to us. I don't think we should burn bridges and stuff like that. But, my approach has basically just been to abstain from conversations that I kind of know are not going to go anywhere productive. Whereby one of the reasons why, I love doing the podcast and I love connecting with Bitcoiners, and I talk to a lot of Bitcoiners offline, just on calls like this, is because those are the people I want to connect with. These are the people that, not through my convincing them, but through their own process of trying to figure things out, have come to a similar, what I think is clarity, but that's my own bias because they're sharing my perspective. But I think they're seeing things clearly, and they're recognizing that it's, there's lies and dishonesty and incompetence and cowardice everywhere. And they want to basically focus on the things that they can control. They want to interact with the people that are aligned with similar values and principles. They want to build things. They want to, contribute to solutions. I mean, the conference coming up is such a great example of that because, last year I came out of Canada to go to the conference. And so, as you might imagine, in Canada, I was surrounded by, the former type of mindset a lot. And then coming to the conference, like everyone you talk to, it's just like you're immediately on the same wavelength. And of course, you're not the same people. You have different interests and different experiences and stuff like that. But it's just great that you line up on some of the most important principles. And then from that basis, you can have honest, open conversations. And what's so great about that is like when I have conversations with people, I'm not trying to get my point across and impose anything on them. Like I think that the purpose of dialogue is for both people to come together, share their perspective, and hopefully generate something novel that both people can then use to integrate back into their perspective and refine it even more. Whereas so much in the discourse today, whether it's happening like around a dinner table, at a bar, or on the mainstream, media stuff, it's, conform to my narrative, or I dismiss you in some way, or I cancel you in some way. You're a racist, misogynist, this, that, the other thing, because you don't think the same way that I think, and so I think we focus on refining ourselves, building relationships with people that have similar values. And, I've talked about this a little bit, but I think most people come to Bitcoin for number go up, right? Or at least that's been the case up till now. I think it could easily be the case that as we move forward in the next 5 to 10 years, people will come for the culture more so than number go up. I mean, again, the conference is a great example of this. I mean, there's going to be a rad party on the last day of it. People are just celebrating being together and being a part of this revolution. Like in an environment where in normie land, everything is so contentious and everything is so tense and everything is so nihilistic, and there's so little meaning and there's so little independent thought, that when people see this burgeoning culture where people are radically individualistic, but they're coming together over shared values and they're exchanging ideas and they're refining themselves and they're building more stable and meaningful and productive lives and communities, like people are like, yeah, I want some of that. That looks great, and that feels good. And so I think what we do is we focus on that. We focus on achieving that for ourselves and contributing to it in our communities and in the culture we're a part of. And that ultimately, that counterculture ultimately becomes the dominant culture. That's hyperbitcoinization in kind of my view. Not everyone is going to be as hardcore as the early adopters, but I think it's inarguable that if we kind of agree that base layer fiat generates a distorted culture and a perverse kind of culture, then base layer Bitcoin is going to generate a different kind of culture. And we're the first ones that are being upgraded to that culture and participating in it and being open to being, refined and formed by those principles and the people and ideas we interact with. So I think all we can do is kind of throw our hands up. I mean, and the last thing I'll say is I stopped trying to determine the logic or reason behind any of the madness happening in clown world a long time ago, right? Like my family's in the restaurant business in Canada, and you have to appreciate that a lot of time the business owner doesn't want to do this shit, or the head of the NBA might not want to do it, but there's so much political pressure. There's so much like pressure coming from all angles to do something. And that's why so many of these solutions are so nonsensical, because they're literally only there to signal that we're doing something, we're a part of the solution, and people don't care if it's effective or not. Like those glass dividers they put in restaurants for a while, or the plastic ones, like you can't hear shit when you're speaking at it. So you come around it so that you can speak face to face with the person behind the counter, and then you're just back to normal, right? So none of it makes any sense, or very little of it makes any sense, if any of it does. But we live in a culture where the signal, virtue signaling or signaling that you're doing something to conform to the narrative is more important than actually logically reasoning about the issue and taking what is the most sensible action to take. And that's why we call it clown world. And, we're going to have a lot of entertainment in that regard. Still moving forward, but hopefully we're all contributing to something that is, again, antithetical to that. That's far more grounded in logic and reason and truth. And, we'll get a lot of stuff wrong, and we're all imperfect individuals, and that's always going to show up in our behavior and the cultures that stem from our behavior. But I think it's going to be a massive upgrade to what we're contending with right now.
Definitely. And speaking from waking lions among the sheep, John, I really got to commend you, Gigi. I think it was Robert Breedlove, and I know I'm missing someone. When you guys talked with Jordan Peterson, watching a guy understand Bitcoin, I think, Saylor might be the only one that rivals him. Obviously, he was announced as a speaker at Bitcoin 2022. I'm really excited to listening to him speak. I think he's a really elegant speaker. Sometimes I get lost within his speaking because he's so good with his words, and I have to go back and like chew on it for a while. But I guess pivoting now back to, bear market and bull markets and such, I see in the next 5 to 10 years, things are going to be very tough, I believe, for the G7 nations. So the United States and the Canadas alike. that, and I keep getting to this point in my logic where I like get stuck, that I'm going to steal something from BTC Sessions, or Ben from BTC Sessions. He says like Bitcoin flushes out bad behavior. And he was saying on one of his most recent Why Are We Bullish podcast that he loves it. Like it hurts obviously in the short term when we watch as the price cascades down because of long liquidations of people either taking really long positions or shorting it or whatever and getting liquidated up or down. But he always is like, good. I'm glad that this billion-dollar hedge fund or billionaire gets liquidated out of their position for doing something ridiculous, taking out 40-to-1 leverage or whatever it may be. But I guess my thing is connecting Mark Moss's end of an empire thesis, that the fourth turning and the different business cycle lining up with the empire, ending of empire, as well as the political cycles. I guess I'm a little worried for the G7 nations, and I know that's selfishly saying this, but while Bitcoin flushes out bad behavior, it can be said the US and Canada and the G7 nations, or the US dollar hegemony alike, have had bad decisions. And we're watching this play out in clown world and the real world. So I see a world where, we're having a Bitcoin bull market, but at the same time, our country's even getting worse and worse, meaning that I'm going to use this perfect example. Let's just say there's 10 million Bitcoins between Canada and the US alone. But we need to send those goods abroad for whatever reason to get oil, to get, whatever it may be from China, Russia, Taiwan, Vietnam, other countries that can give us cheaper goods. But even to China's point, they don't want the US dollar anymore. They want the goods. We were talking about earlier that they've kind of have a deal set up with Saudi Arabia that while they price it in US dollars, they really just want the oil and they have first right to refusal to it, and they'll take it and they'll sell it if they need be. I guess my point is, in a hyper Bitcoinized world, do you see the US and Canada coming down from where they are as not being global powers? But I guess, how do we get the sats back into our economies if we export them for cheaper goods, whatever they may be? And like my meaning is that the price is going up, but like our economy is getting worse because we have less of the Bitcoin network, whether it's in, Satoshis or whatever unit of account we're using, Bitcoin or whatever. I guess as we're getting poorer as countries, but how do we bring it back into our country? I guess to be more productive, or is it like, do we have to start doing something heinous to try and get it back in? I'll pass that to you.
Well, I mean, whether you're an individual or you're a country, the way you get sats flow is you provide value. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about this emerging system. You can't so easily, or in perhaps many cases not at all, you can't rent seek, and you can't cozy up to the spigot and just get easy, cheap new money. So there will definitely be a reckoning in that regard. Like the countries that have benefited from reserve currency status or other, monetarily derived powers, let's say, they're going to have to reorient things, and maybe even nation states will take on a different look. Maybe they'll shrink, maybe we'll go, maybe some other form of governance model will slowly emerge to account for this. I like to think of it as, first of all, I think we'll look back and be like, wait, so every country had their own currency and the currencies were traded against each other, and global trade had to contend with the ability for every country to manipulate their currency. So if like a country was just like, oh, our exports are too expensive, all right, we'll print another 25% of the currency or something like that. And they'll drop down temporarily before the market figures out and rebalances. And that'll be good for us. Like, it'll be seen as utter insanity that's how things were structured. And with Bitcoin, I mean, and not to mention all like, the friction of sending money, right? Like you send a Swift transfer and it's 3 to 5 business days, and it has a high cost, and it has the currency convert everywhere. Like, I just imagine all the silos being lifted, and what we have is just a network of value transfer that nobody can change. And what that ends up doing is it ends up finding the highest concentration of value for whatever demand is, for whatever is being demanded. And that ends up accruing the sats, because for what's being demanded, this provides the best value. And I mean, over time, I think you have to have a faith that will mean that it'll orient all of our behaviors more properly at aligning with what is most valued and determining how we can satisfy that value to derive some for our own life. And, it probably means that the parts of the world that have been disenfranchised by, colonial powers and predatory, monetary policy, whether it's through IMF or through an individual country or whatever, like, the global South, let's say, broadly speaking, they'll probably be far better off because the playing field will be more even. And, if they have resources or, human or natural, that they can bring to bear that are demanded by the market, they should be able to do so without being stifled in various ways from doing so. And so I'm super excited for that, because isn't that what we all want? Like when we're in the park at grade school, right? Like there was always a cheater, right? Like, hey, fuck, you're cheating, right? Like you're not abiding by the rules of the game, and that's not fair. And to know, and things have been so not fair in the world for a long time. And that's meant that like power and wealth has accrued to a very small group of individuals that are at the top of that power hierarchy and at the detriment of everybody below it. And so what I'm super excited by is when you're on an open playing field, all the responsibility gets shifted back to you, right? It's not about who did what. It's not about, oh, I want to get closer to this person because they're closer to that person and they have a greater advantage here and there. If it's all even, then it's all on you. And it's like, okay, how are you going to provide more value? Why are you deserving of more value? What type of latent talents and skills do you have within you that you can refine such that people find your work or whatever you do more valuable? And if you can do that, it's almost guaranteed that value will accrue to you, because nobody can stop it from accruing to you if you're genuinely providing value. And so that's super exciting. Then we get real competition, and we get all the blockages to real value being expressed and accruing to the people that are most capable of providing it being removed. And I think it goes without saying that at a certain point has a material impact on the structure of the nation state, right? Because the nation state it's at the size it is and has the power that it has, largely because it's able to siphon off the wealth of its population surreptitiously through inflation and through seigniorage, right? So when that's no longer the case, and the large bureaucratic apparatus they can't feed that to the same extent, well, what does the nation state look like? Maybe it fractures, maybe it takes on another form. Who knows? These are questions that I think we're likely going to find out. But the punchline is going to be that value will be able to flow more easily and more efficiently and more fairly to the people that are most providing it. And that may be a bad thing for America World Police as it exists today, but it may be a good thing for the world at large. So I think we'll have to reframe what we even want. Like, I'll be the first to say, I as far as like founding of countries goes, I think America is probably at the top of the list of being founded on the best principles and with a structure that is most impervious to being corrupted. But as we're seeing today, it don't really matter. Maybe it lasts for a time, but it's still able to be corrupted, and it's still able to do, even founded on such great principles, it's still able to be used to carry out so much damage to the world in various forms. And so I think, I mentioned this in an article I wrote just a few days ago regarding the conference, but like, I know this sounds a bit shitty and it's still in this day and age, but I don't consider myself a Canadian, really. Like, at least I don't feel an allegiance to that. Like, I feel an allegiance to people, to principles and values and people who share them. Like, why would, I had nothing to do with where I was born. Nobody does. And why should we feel an allegiance just because of that? I'm really grateful that I grew up in a stable and a safe environment, because that allowed me to not have to worry about those things, and I could focus on other interests and other, development. But the most important things that, as far as I can tell in life, are, what do you value most? What's at the top of your value hierarchy? What are the principles that you most orient your life by? And if that's the case, then your countrymen, as it were, like your brothers and sisters, should be the ones who hold those same values and principles in just as high esteem. And that's what I feel like. And that's why going to the Bitcoin conference, I feel like I'm going home, because it's with a high concentration of people that value the same values and principles as me. And as a result, feel similarly about things and have similar interests and want to orient themselves similarly in the world, instead of some arbitrary lines that are drawn on a map that, if you look at the history of nation states over the last 5,000 years, guess what? They get redrawn a lot. Give it some time, and Germany's not Germany, and Italy's not Italy, and Iran's not Iran, and America won't be America. Like, all that stuff is transient. What's eternal? Eternal is being, aligned and committed to truth and freedom and liberty, and those are things that you decide internally, not some arbitrary thing external to you. So
I have to chime in with this. Everyone will always be corrected on this show, John. It's not you. I've corrected Chris numerous times. I've corrected countless other guests. It's Iran, not Iran. As an Iranian citizen, it is my duty to correct everyone.
Thank you.
However, I want to like really explore this, because you're absolutely right. The idea that nation states, or like the idea of nationalism, pride for your country, like, it's all a fallacy. It's all made up by an arbitrary entity that said, like, oh, we're going to group you guys together and for these reasons and whatnot. And I would even take it further. I would say religion is another example of that to a degree, it was created through these ideas of, these are the values that we believe. And so therefore you should buy into what we say if you agree with some of these values. I would say it goes as far back as, when we were hunter gatherers, and really our only motivations were just, what am I going to eat? Am I safe? Are my kinsmen safe? And I think it's about building those communities, like you have mentioned, within the Bitcoin community, and other such communities that exist. One of my favorite things about sports, one of my all-time favorite writers, Rick Riley, put it so perfectly. Sports are the only reason why your 85-year-old grandma can have a legitimate case to hate her next door neighbor because they have a Packers flag out front and she is a Vikings fan. And I think that to a degree, we always will look for, as human beings, some reason to be in a group or in a clan or kinsman, whether it's because we agree on the financial system completely being destroyed, or that our leadership is a complete farce. I do, however, challenge this notion that, like, everyone in Bitcoin has the same values. My value proposition for joining Bitcoin is different than yours, and it's different than Chris's. And I think as we expand Bitcoin's network to hopefully in the near future include all 7.9 billion people on this planet, I think you will enter into this realm of, well, there are some Bitcoiners who value it for this reason and that reason. Thankfully, this is the only true democracy we have, where you have to have a majority consensus to make a change. I want to present you the opportunity of, you have 51% of the entire nodes backing whatever change you want. Is there a change you would make to the Bitcoin protocol right now as it sits?
That's a good question, but I want to address something else first. And I agree, of course, we don't all share the same principles and values. And which is why I usually say, like, a high concentration of those principles and values at an event like the conference or something. And of course, just generalizing in general. But I think it is the case that, for example, like, Bitcoin allows you to have such a strong, let's say, relation to your monetary property, which you might say is emblematic of your work or your time or your energy or what have you, that cannot really be violated without your participation. And so I think that kind of necessarily means that freedom, at least of that kind, of your optionality in a market-based world, is a value that you almost kind of have to subscribe to if you see value in Bitcoin. And so I'm sure I'm sure we all have a variety of differences on different things, and your point about, religion and this, because it makes sense to align. Well, let's put it this way. What determines what you're going to find valuable in the world, from, an object that you might buy for your home to your highest ambition for your life? And, basically, if we borrow from, Peterson's framing on this stuff, it's like, we all have value hierarchies internally. And when we confront things, that thing enters our value hierarchy, and there's a process of comparison to determine where it lands. And those value hierarchies end up generating something that's at the top, something that is of the most value to us, that helps us orient ourselves in relation to all other values. And you might call that God, or you might call it a spirituality, or you might just call it the highest values and principles that you hold, but they're going to have an influence on how you engage the world. And so I think when you see others for whom the same values and principles or ideas have ascended to the top of that hierarchy, you say, hey, you're the type, like, the world is uncertain and the world is threatening. Let's cooperate because we seem to be lining up on a lot of things, and let's cooperate for our mutual self-interest, so we both can be better. And maybe, so nation states way back, or tribes, or, when they began to happen, when we first started to cooperate, it was probably for that reason. And at the founding of America, probably something similar. People got together and said, hey, we don't like the current situation. These are some of the principles and values that we think are the best and are most integral to developing a society of freedom and prosperity and peace. Everybody in agreement, like, how should we sort this out? And you end up working together to, you end up working together in accord with those values that you've identified and that you've put forward. And as you say, I think religion, the religious enterprise, is very much about that too. And in both cases, both politics and religion, imperfect people and corrupt institutions get in the way, and that becomes problematic at kind of tainting the original, maybe good, altruistic, pure intentions of the enterprise. And that's why, again, Bitcoin is so interesting, because it's like an institution, but it can't be corrupted. And this actually brings me to your direct question: is I wouldn't change anything, because I think changing it is like, that's the biggest thing we could do wrong. Because we're always going to have, we're imperfect, and there's a lot of information we don't have, and that we have a lot of biases that we're not aware of. And so, and we don't have a full understanding of how the world works, and we don't have an understanding of many things. And so we're always going to think that something should be a certain way. And I think what Bitcoin presents us with, possibly for the first and only time, is, okay, you have this opportunity to express, communicate, store value in this way, to have kind of like a social contract that contains those things. I think if we decide, oh, well, the economic, like the security doesn't really work out the way we thought it will, and maybe we need a little bit of ongoing inflation to incentivize the security of the network moving forward. So let's just tweak it that way a little bit. Or, let's tweak it this way a little bit, because right now the political winds or the dominant mindset or narrative of the time dictates that this might be a good idea. Then we're in this, well, I think doing it, we corrupt it. That's what corruption is. Like, we tend to think of corruption as ruining something, but that's usually determined in hindsight. Corruption is basically just changing something. And I think Bitcoin's immaculate conception and the way it kind of percolated up, and before anyone really noticed it, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think its immutability is its potentially most valuable characteristic. And I think maybe our most important task as stewards of it is to not change it in those fundamental ways, and to just recognize that we don't know the extent of the dynamic that exists between human behavior and an immutable, unchangeable, absolute object. And I think we need to have some kind of, like, even a faith that submitting to that immutability is probably the way in which we derive the most benefit from it, rather than assuming to always know what needs to be changed about it to optimize it for our transient needs. Because I think if we pursue that path, we end up destroying what's most valuable about it in the end. And that would be a real shame.
Yeah, we as humans have this inherent flaw, it seems, to buy into this broader narrative and find groups that we align with. I have very loudly throughout my life always condemned religion as being one of the main catalysts for so many of the wars that we have seen. But even if we were to remove religion or remove nation states, like, we would find other ways to band together and find ways to fight with those who disagree or oppose us. I have very loudly said I changed my mind a little bit, where I do see there is validity in the maxis that have helped keep Bitcoin alive and going up until this point. There is going to come a point, however, where those who get involved in Bitcoin are not going to be Bitcoin maxis. They're not even going to really understand money. They're just going to do it because they live in El Salvador and their president said, hey, you have to accept Bitcoin for your business now. How do we help those people see what we see? Is there some dialogue that you like to use or any sort of points that you like to highlight for them to help them better digest Bitcoin when they may be forced, where it may be forced upon them, and they be maybe a little bit have that feeling of my back's against the wall, I'm going to push you back if you're pushing me there?
It's a great question, man. The answer is no. I don't really have like an easy answer. I think we all end up having this understanding that we have through a lot of cuts and scrapes and getting wrecked. And, that's just kind of the hero's journey of this thing, is taking your licks as you come to a better understanding of it all. And you'd like to help people avoid that, but there actually might even be a kind of a interesting corollary to religion here. Whereas, we don't need to break into the religious discussion generally, but just to say that I think part of the reason why those institutions may have become corrupted is because they have tried to control the intermediation between individual and whatever that higher power, source of meaning, value might be. And then, the imperfections of those people and the understandings of those people get in between, and they become too powerful there. And the people that they're trying to ostensibly help end up thinking that, those people are the authority on things or something like that, versus whether it's your own relationship with the quote unquote divine that you stumble through life and ultimately discover for yourself, or whether it's your own relationship with understanding the unique value of Bitcoin, what it is and why it should remain as such. I think probably needs to happen on your own as well for it to have any sort of staying power, right? Because we all know this. Like if someone this is why you got to learn hard lessons yourself in life. Because if someone just tells you, hey, like, don't do this, you at some point you may take it for granted. You may say, oh, like, why was it so important? Like why shouldn't I do that? And then you disappear, or then the institution leaves, or the wise old man dies, and the next generation doesn't feel the salience of the understanding or the message, and they make the mistake. So I think what we need to try to do, or I think what is happening, and my own opinion on it, is back to the individual taking the responsibility and having the courage to pursue that journey on their own. And maybe there are some ways that they can be assisted, but always hopefully not presuming to be authoritative on it, and not presuming to tell people what it is and what it should be, and allowing them to discover it for themselves. And maybe they discover it in the same way that we have, or maybe they discover something novel and new about it, an angle that we haven't considered. And, I'm certainly interested in all these new people coming into the space and getting their intellectual firepower made available to us all, so that we can continue to understand ourselves. Because like, even though we're early in it, which seems like we're trying to kind of shepherd people in, we're still very much a part, like caught up in this phenomenon, in this process. And we're still being upgraded by it. And we're still developing and enhancing our understanding about what it is, and, how it works. And the more kind of esoteric or elements of it, again, we haven't reached the bottom of the rabbit hole. Nobody has, it doesn't seem, right? So we're all still on that journey of discovery. And I think if it's going to have lasting staying power, and if it's not going to be corrupted, we have to resist the urge of institutionalizing the understanding of it, or something like that.
I love that. The Bitcoin hero's journey. All of us are a part of it. All of us have to go through this battle. One of the battles I think that all of us face on a day-to-day basis is the different FUD topics that get brought up. I myself have one or two topics where if someone says it to me, I just get angry, and I will jam so many facts down your throat that you're frozen. You have no response. Is there a FUD topic that really grinds your gears, that you're just like, you're so dumb for thinking this, and this is why? Like, I'll start with mine. I'll say that the use of Bitcoin for illicit activities, like, I will say this every single time. If you count up how much Bitcoin is used for all illegal activities across the entire history of Bitcoin, I promise you it's less than the amount of US dollars that was used in the last 5 years. I've even changed in the last 5 years. There are more US dollars exchanging hands illegally than Bitcoin is.
I guess my answer would be this. For most people, the FUD isn't genuine critique. It's meant to be just lobbing FUD at you because like they don't want to know the answer, right? And if it's that type of people that just want an argument or want to be dismissive, then like I don't even engage, and it's obvious, from the outset. And I have to say, like, apart from my immediate family, who, I just like to kind of harass for fun about Bitcoin, I'm pretty zen about the orange pilling. I mean, I don't usually, when I meet new people, I don't even tell them that I'm involved in Bitcoin whatsoever, because I don't know. I just feel like it's all going to happen in due course. And I don't, I do the podcast and I put out information in another way. I don't need to be so directly persuasive. But if people are genuine in those questions, like, hey, like I'm trying to understand this stuff. I read an article the other day where, it talked about volatility, or it talked about, like you said, being used for drugs and stuff like that. Is there any truth to this? Like, is that what you think? Then yeah, sure. I'll share my perspective with them and kind of help them understand that there's a lot of misunderstandings, both intentional and unintentional. And different people benefit from propagating FUD and all that kind of stuff. And like anyone, if anyone's ever genuine about any topic, I love those conversations. Doesn't matter if it's Bitcoin or religion or, science of any kind, like, or history. Those are great. It's an opportunity to learn and share perspectives. But if it's just, we all have encountered those arrogant people in our lives who are just like, oh yeah, drug money, or, like whatever, keep going, nerd, or whatever the insult is. Like, what's the point in engaging those conversations? They're basically just doing it to either get you mad or dismiss you. And there's no real point.
Hugh, I'll answer this as well. I know me having an engineering degree by trade, by going to college, I'd always grind my gears when people bring up the energy FUD. And, we're going down that path in a way that, governments might say, oh, okay, if your house ends in an even number, you got to turn off your electricity for days that are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, and then they flip flop. And then the other, if your ends in an even or odd or even, whatever, you've got to do the inverse. And just in how clown world has revealed itself this year of staying locked in your homes, getting your salary cut, wearing masks, you have to get vaccinated. I know that there's going to be people that are ratting people out like, oh, I saw they had lights on in their house in the midst of winter, or, I saw them turn on the heat and I saw smoke coming out of their smokestack, and they're going to like try and report people for using energy if we literally have a collapse of our grids and stuff. So that's just something that like grinds my gears when people say like, oh, energy use is maleficent or, harmful to the environment or harmful to other people, or it's bad to use energy. That just really gets me going.
Totally.
I'll take it back. Yeah, go
ahead. 2
ahead.
points to that real quick. Sorry, John. I do want to interject because in the state of Texas, they have literally created a law to incentivize snitching. Fucking bullshit. I'm not going to dive into that law of the marriage because as 3 men, we should not have an opinion on that and just listen to the women in our lives of what they say and need. That's my 2 cents there. And energy FUD, absolutely. If you just look up how much it costs or how much energy every single ATM in the United States uses up to operate, it's more than Bitcoin. Plain and simple. That is all, John. Sorry to interrupt you, please.
Well, I'm just basically echoing that by saying that's why, again, I'm pretty zen about it all, but it's easy, like this ESG stuff and the associated, or maybe let's say the instigation for it amongst the climate catastrophist sort of narrative. It's brought a moral dimension to the usage of energy. And I think that's why right from the get-go, so many of us were like, it's never going to be enough. You shouldn't kowtow to this stuff because it's not about the fact that Bitcoin uses 40% or 70% or 90% or 100% clean, quote unquote, clean energy like hydro or solar. It's not about that. That's just what they're latching onto, maybe because it's easy right now, even though, as we all know, like Bitcoin probably uses more, quote unquote, clean or renewable energy than most industries. But it's that they don't see the energy being devoted to Bitcoin as a worthwhile use of energy. And it's like, hold on, when was that any of your business? Like, if I want to put on crazy Christmas lights at, December, or keep them up all year long, like nobody's got an issue with that, right? If I want to leave my lights on all the time, so I think it's just that there was, if you don't understand Bitcoin, and in particular, if your interests are not aligned with Bitcoin, i.e. if you're, aligned with the existing monetary system, then it's just a way of dismissing and discrediting the enterprise entirely. And trying, we were talking about that grip of control earlier, trying to maintain a grip of control over this thing in any way possible, and it'll play out. And I know some people don't think it's such a bad thing and other people do. And some companies are adhering to it. Others are trying to take advantage of it in different ways. So it'll play out, and the jurisdictions, I guess, that get it more right will benefit from that for a period of time. But as we say, everything is good for Bitcoin in the end, and all the FUD is ultimately, just that. But it doesn't stop it from happening. And I would think that we're in for, especially given what you mentioned earlier about, bad guys using it, we're probably in for a lot more FUD in the not too distant future. I mean, fuck, we might even be bad guys at some point, right? Or at least labeled as such.
Yeah, let me tell you guys,
shadowy super coders.
All of you who have now been listed by the Canadian government as a terrorist for donating to the trucker campaign, I welcome you with open arms. I have been labeled such since about 2001 in my country. So if you need help dealing with this, feel free to reach out as always.
Very
Not
nice.
to make light of the situation, but genuinely to showcase how ridiculous it is. John, I do want to ask, we have a little bit of time left if you'll entertain us and stick around, but I want to ask a little bit now about the conference. We're all going to be in Miami. We're really excited to get down there. Is there anything in particular that you are most excited to see this year at Bitcoin 22?
I mean, I'm most excited to hang out in the grounds with the plebs. I mean, that's what I did for most of the time last year. Just meet everyone who I interacted with on Twitter or podcasts over the preceding 2 years. I mean, there's really nothing better. And then, there's always like a dinner or drinks at night, and there's always all these peripheral events, and you just get to strengthen those relationships. As far as speakers are concerned, I mean, Bukele apparently has some cool announcements he's going to make. I don't know if you guys have the inside track on that, but I'm looking forward to what that is. But of course, when Peterson was announced, I was super stoked about that. And by the way, it was Richard James. He was the fourth on that podcast initially with Peterson. But yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to watch his slow kind of drop down the rabbit hole. And I always knew that once his brain kind of latched onto it, it wouldn't be able to let it go. And I think we're kind of seeing that now. And I'll be interested to hear from him and see how far he is. There's obvious people approach it in different ways, and he has a very busy life, so maybe he can't obsess about it as much as the three of us might. But it'll be interesting to hear his current thoughts on it. And what I'm really interested in hearing is his impression of the event. Because maybe up till this point, he's interacted with a few of us on podcasts and stuff, and probably met some in real life. But what's he going to think about such a huge and just really well done, amazing vibes? Most of the people there are just awesome, and so many, it's an event, right? This Bitcoin, the last year was amazing, and this year is obviously going to be bigger and more crazy. But I think what's he going to think that this phenomenon is at that kind of a scale, and there's that much kind of passion and interest, and he hopefully he'll have a chance to hear and speak with some of the other big headliners, and I think it'll probably leave an impression on him. So it'll be interesting to hear that. But everyone, man, I mean, it's family. And that's the best part about it. You get to go and hang out with all your brothers and sisters, and there's nothing better.
All you plebs out there listening, you heard it here. John's trying to hang out with you, so make sure you find him. And as always, you know the rule. If you find me and I'm not too busy, we'll roll one up and we'll smoke it together. To your point, though, we're watching this influx of people like Jordan Peters. Before we go down that rabbit hole, use code YTMAG to get 10% off. It's literally all over this screen. If you have not realized that is the code that helps Chris and I keep our jobs after the conference, you've been under a rock for some time. So please use code YTMAG and get 10% off. Now, to actually have this conversation, we're watching people like Jordan Peterson get involved. We watched over the last, I'd say, 18 months, people like Ray Dalio get involved. Kevin O'Leary, who's famous for Shark Tank, like very loudly accused Pomp of pushing forward a Ponzi scheme and then flip the script. And as we see these sort of big, prominent investor types and just public figures get involved in Bitcoin, what are your thoughts on that? What effect do you think that has on both the short-term and long-term prospects of Bitcoin?
I mean, it probably doesn't have much influence on the long-term prospects. Short-term, if Ray and Peter Thiel and O'Leary and Elon come out in the same month and say, it's a 50% allocation in our fund, then that might be the type of news that gets some people off the sidelines, or some capital that's been waiting on the sidelines might get FOMO, like some of that institutional capital might come in and there might be a price spike. But then when they peel it, when they pull it back, 2 quarters from now and say, oh, it was just a temporary allocation, and now we've pared it down to 5% and that hype goes away. So those sorts of announcements and those sorts of people don't really interest me. And also, like, I understand that not everyone's going to be like a maximalist pleb sort of mentality about this stuff, but like there is a difference between a Saylor and a Kevin O'Leary, right? Like, and both ostensibly extremely wealthy prior to Bitcoin. So it's not just a wealth effect that's taking place, and nor is it just like the expectation of mad gains, right? There's something else happening. And I would say, like, when Saylor came in, he really fell down the rabbit hole and seemed to go deep. Whereas I think someone like Kevin O'Leary, at least at this stage, is like, yeah, well, first of all, I think he has a broader crypto strategy, that case in particular, but I think he sees it as, potential return, but I think he may see it as something that he will sell for fiat in the future. Whereas the three of us and Saylor and many others probably know that Bitcoin is the exit strategy. And with that comes a different way, different mentality, a different way of investigating the meaning and the understanding of all this stuff. So, it's for everyone, and everyone can come in and they'll do their thing, and it's fun. Like I remember meeting Kevin last year at the conference, but not everyone's gonna become a hardcore maximalist laser-eyed pleb, and I'd put Saylor in that category.
Well, I am kind of curious though. Like, is it necessarily a bad thing if we have people who get involved in Bitcoin and have thousands of Bitcoin, given the net worths of people like Dalio and O'Leary, but they don't see it the way we see it? So in theory, they're going to end up selling their Bitcoin to people like us at a very high price. Yeah, but it's still going to keep going higher. In the way that we see it, should we be actually right about the end game of all of this? Is it necessarily a bad thing?
No, not at all. I mean, it's transactions. It's current transactions and future transactions. And that's what an economy is predicated on, So whether they stay for a year, 10 years, forever, Laura, it doesn't really matter. So I don't mean to say that they're bad. I'm just saying, like, they haven't taken the orange pill the way some of us have, and that's absolutely fine. They're liquidity for the network, they're transactions, they're supporting infrastructure in different ways, they're investing in companies. It's all good. I don't hate on them at all, but you can tell when you're in the presence of another laser-eyed pleb, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Fair enough. Do we think 100K this year?
Oh man, I don't know. I've never done a price prediction, so I probably won't start now, but I will just say that hopefully not too soon, because it seems like the conference in Miami is going to be quite a party, and I wouldn't want to have to like rally everyone again for the 100K party like a month later in Miami. We want to space it out a little bit, right? End of year I'd be okay with, or even 2023, but nobody wants to fly right back to Miami right after having a conference and still being hungover, So hopefully we have a little bit of breathing room afterwards.
Fair enough. If you need me though, I might just stay camped out at Miami Beach for a month or two. Who knows?
Yeah, it could be worse.
I do want to give you the opportunity as well to maybe just share with our audience a little bit of what you have cooking, what you're working on, and where maybe some of our audience can also find your podcast.
Sure. Yeah, my headspace lately, both on the podcast and some of the writing I've done, or one piece I've published, another one I'm working on, is really trying to dig into some of the things we touched on here today, which is like, how does this weird protocol that exists on the internet, how and why does this protocol influence people's values and behavior so much? And one of the fascinating phenomenons that I've been following for years now is like these individual transformations that seem to be very common. They don't always take place in the same way, and they're not always the same, of course, but like people seem to change in many cases fairly dramatically and reorient their lives and that kind of stuff as a result of learning about this thing. And, so I've been trying to investigate why that is, and that investigation and thinking about it and reading and writing and speaking with people has kind of brought me to the doorstep of other domains of the utmost meaning and other domains that have a strong transformative effect on people. We were referencing religion and spirituality and that kind of stuff before, and that's kind of where I'm winding up with this. And I'm trying to tease out what's going on there, and how should we be understanding or approaching this thing, and what context should we be putting it in. So that's where I've been doing most of my stuff. And I do that on my podcast. It's called Bitcoin Rapid Fire. And, I have a Substack and stuff, which you can find on Twitter. And that's where, and I have a website too, bitcoinrapidfire.com, where all that stuff is. And I also do the CT podcast. It's called Closing the Loop. CT is a subsidiary of a big Norwegian energy company. Came into the space last year. They released a shareholder letter that I think made the rounds. A lot of people read. Norwegian billionaire who, kind of got orange pilled and wanted to be more involved in the space. And CT's been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes this upcoming year, probably going to do a lot more. So I'm super excited for that. And my role there is primarily helping them with the podcast and pushing forward some of the podcasting 2.0 technology there. So Gigi's another member of the team, and a bunch of other great guys that are doing a lot of work to make it so that value can be, what we call it, kind of set free, so people can express value, and the implicit and explicit censorship that exists in the media publishing landscape today can be diminished, and, people can speak freely and express themselves freely and not be detrimentally affected when doing so is counter to dominant narratives or platform wokeism or any of that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm up to.
Love it. For those of you who've been enjoying this conversation that we've had with John, be sure to check it out. It sounds like you'll just be able to dive deeper and deeper down these rabbit holes. John, could you maybe tease something that you're working on for maybe the next episode that we didn't touch on here for those who may be curious?
The next podcast episode? Well, I've, talking about these deep conversations about deeper levels of meaning around this thing. I've been doing a series with my good friend Eric Kaysen, and he's done a lot of great writing at cryptosovereignty.org, where he shares a lot of his perspective on this kind of stuff. And it's just, we would always have these conversations when we would speak, and they'd be we'd almost think like this is a little bit too bizarre and weird to like put out publicly. But then, over time, you're just like, well, fuck it. Why? Who cares? Why not just let it rip and put it out publicly? And if people enjoy it, then great. And so they're like 1 to 2 hour conversations where we just go in those directions that seem completely batshit insane, right? Like talk about religion and the second coming and all this kind of stuff. And for the purpose of, you kind of have to say the words and share the ideas around to see if they actually are nonsense or if there's any credibility to them. And that, from my perspective, that's how we, refine our understanding and push it forward. And so I've been really enjoying that series with him. And the most recent one dropped yesterday, I think. And the feedback's been great too. So what I'm finding is that we're not the only weirdos thinking about this thing in those sort of terms. And people seem to appreciate that someone is exploring these more these ideas that we might be more sheepish about sharing around the family dinner table, So I guess that's where, the thing that I've been most enjoying lately.
What topic is taboo right now at the Vallis family dinner table?
Well, nothing really, because I've always been the weirdo of the family and everyone knows to expect, that I might say anything at any time. But I mean, I wrote this piece recently. It's called Money Messiah, and subtitle God, Bitcoin, and the Evolution of Consciousness. And it's a 40-page article about those issues. And, not only do I kind of have to tackle right at the beginning the modern day understanding of religion and how perhaps we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, or maybe it needs another look, as so many things do when you start to understand Bitcoin, or when Bitcoin starts to reshape your perspective on things. You realize like, oh, maybe I need to look at this differently, and maybe I dismissed this or that thing too quickly, and then lead into, a fairly lengthy discourse on value and meaning. And then I kind of finish with looking at Bitcoin in the context of some of the most profound, religious occurrences in the past, and how interpretations that might be applicable to Bitcoin. And so, those are pretty far out things. And I bring that up actually because my dad read it, and I usually actually, I'm bringing him to the Bitcoin conference, which I'm super pumped about, because over the last year, he's become pretty orange pilled, but he's been listening to my podcast since the beginning. And early days, it was like, not standard conversations. I like to think like mine were always a little bit different, but it would be like, Jeff Booth would come on and we'd talk about what he talks about, and it would be more mainstream stuff. And now it's way more in the direction of like making these mad speculations about what this thing may mean in a spiritual or religious context. And I don't know really yet. I haven't really had the chance to talk to him, so I don't know how he feels about some of the things that I wrote in that piece. But I'm going to be with him soon for the conference, so I'm sure we'll have lots of time to talk about it. But it's that kind of stuff. And I guess my opinion, just to cap it off, is like, you got to risk going too far to know that you've gone far enough. Like, you got to know ideas can be so taboo or so off limits that you can't use them, because then you might potentially be cutting yourself off to a more truthful understanding of things. So that's what I use, the podcast for and the writing for, is just and I finish it all by saying, yeah, maybe I am insane. Maybe we're all a little nuts. We got to appreciate that that's a possibility. But if not, and if the logic, in particular in this written piece, has any validity, what does that mean? Like, and how should we approach this emerging understanding of this thing, and how it's reframing and reorienting our understanding of so many other things? And that's what's so engaging about being involved in all this, for all of us. Like, one of the things that you could say is like pretty common amongst the quote unquote Bitcoin culture is like, there's a pretty ferocious appetite for new knowledge and understanding. It's like, why, when you see like a new podcast drops with someone that you're really interested in, you put it to the top of the list and you listen to it immediately. And why there's a hunger to understand what's going on, both in the macro world and with Bitcoin and with psychology and history. And maybe it's a self-selection thing, and those people are being brought in and just amplified. Or maybe I've observed that some people that never had interest in any of that kind of stuff are kind of experiencing some kind of an awakening. And again, this is why the religious language might be applicable, because that's not a super normal thing. So like I keep saying, we're wrapped up in this. We're not on the sidelines observing it. We're in the eye of the storm. So sometimes it can be difficult to get the proper vantage point to see the big picture. But I think all of us attempting to do so and seeing with clarity and refining our understanding is the best way to make sure that we're engaging this properly and leveraging it for maximal benefit in our lives and the lives and in our interactions with the people that we care about. So on we go.
Awesome, John. Well, you've left me with a lot to digest and think about, and I have my call to action to go and read this paper that you wrote. Excited to meet you. Excited to meet your father down in Bitcoin Miami. Guys, get your tickets. Use code YTMAC to get 10% off. We're going to cut now to a quick commercial break, and we'll be joined shortly by Nolan for a new episode of The Breakup.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, hey, what's up, guys? We're back. We're live. It's just me and Chris for a little bit until Nolan comes back and joins us. I have a lot of digesting to do as far as what we talked about. I'm a big believer that religion and the religious perspective that a lot of Bitcoiners take on Bitcoin can be a bit of a turnoff, but it has valid claims. I don't know, Chris, if you have any thoughts on that.
I feel like I just got to unpack a lot of it. It's always good talking to John. He was actually one of my first guests on my podcast, and he's very gracious with his time. But yeah, no, I definitely got to listen back to it and digest everything that we talked about. It was fun.
Yeah, and just a reminder, guys, John will be there at Bitcoin 22. Chris and myself will be there. Nolan will be there. We're all going to be hanging out in Miami. If you want to actually meet us in person, if you want to actually have a conversation with us in person, like buy a ticket, use code YTMAG. Shout out to everyone who bought tickets yesterday on the live show. We appreciate you guys helping us keep our jobs, but we're not done yet. We still need to keep our jobs. So smash that subscribe button. Make sure you share. And we are now joined by Breakup extraordinaire, Nolan. How you doing, man?
I love life. I love it more every day. Today's show is especially cool because if you're into simulation theory, you think about the simulation, super winks from the simulation today on this show. Like the simulation is just winking at us nonstop on the show today. So let's get started. First of all, you know what I noticed when I looked at the map? I love maps. I look at it and I go on Google Earth and all these things all the time. What I noticed, this show's called The Breakup. We look at relationships and show in money and compare them for Bitcoin and dollars. When I'm looking at the two recent super spreader events on the globe, this shows about relationships, breakups. I look at Canada, and then I look with all the truckers, and then everything that's going on in Russia with the debanking. And I'm saying, in terms of the breakup, it looks like the top is like off. Like if we're talking about new relationships, like the top is down on the world. You know, the top of the world is like becoming Bitcoiners, or at least super spreader events. And it looks like Russia is going to be the greatest super spreader event that we've ever seen. We've mentioned this guy named Camille Galib a few times on this show, and Camille has these incredible Twitter threads constantly. He's analyzed everything. He's from the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center. I don't know much about him before, so I haven't gone in a deep dive in his experience, but boy, is he ever coherent on Russia and Ukraine, and a lot of amazing insight that sort of checks out with me with what little bit I know, but at least it makes sense. He had an amazing thread yesterday called Crisis and Jubilee, and I'll read a bit of it. It was really long. It's almost an essay, and he's recently on his Twitter, if you want to go check it out, has created a series of threads, link backs to these threads, so you can see all kinds of these Twitter threads he's been on lately. So let's start. Russia's spiraling into a deep crisis. It was visible before the war, but now it's rapidly accelerating. And every major crisis entails mass redistribution of power, property, and status, because crisis is essentially a jubilee. And he starts explaining what jubilees were. In ancient Israel, Every 49th year, there was a huge managed default on debts forgiven, any liens on land, anyone in personal servitude, everything would be forgiven. It would be a huge party, and it would be the start of all kinds of new stuff. So it was this huge annulling of obligations. And when we look, Camille says, at what's going on in Russia today, for example, with the ATMs, with the huge lineups at ATMs, and what he writes is all of this is basically, he writes really coherent. This is not a Bitcoiner writing coherently about what's going on with that. He goes, this is all borrowed. We see fiat in all its cruelty. Previously, you could delude yourself that your bank deposits were your own. Nope. It's what you borrowed to the bank. It's what you borrowed to the bank, he says. This loan can be defaulted on. And inflation being another huge jubilee moment in history, that when hyperinflation does happen, you get another one of these jubilee moments. And you see other instances of it. We see all these assets getting frozen around the world, the yachts from Abramovich in Europe and all these other guys. And you see that one of the amazing things with all of this is that he describes it as very unique in Russia, because it's caught between a history that they have between the courtiers, like court courtiers, so people who would introduce you around and show you the way and open doors, and barons. And here's his sort of TLDR. Much of current Russia political dynamics is understandable in the context of conflict between the courtiers and the barons. In the normal times, courtiers will centralize all the power and all the cash flows in their hands. The barons from the really hyper natural resources area, for example, are sort of a threat and must be weakened by the central government in Russia. In peacetime, Russian geography, economy, institutions favor the courtiers over the barons. It's so large, centralized power helps keep control of the sparsely populated situation. Putinism, Putin's political theory, is simply the courtiers winning. However, the Jubilee entails a major redistribution of power, property, and status. Anyone with control over resources may try to default. And he goes on and shows in the 1990s how common this was. That was one of those periods where the barons beat the courtiers in Russian society. And a lot of Putinism was about getting that out of the system. Everything that had grown with this decentralization, decentralized power in provinces became his mission to eradicate. And in fact, even on a level of political federalism, because Russia is supposed to be a federation like America or Canada, and in fact is not anymore at all. Any governor from any state, any bureaucrat from any state is now a federal employee. That just happened last year. The truckers there also, they had trucker problems just like Canada. So these two places that are around the world turning to Bitcoin. We had the trucker situation in Canada and Russia too. The truckers were people they couldn't control, that had all kinds of ways of getting through the system, a bit maybe like the original Freemasons in medieval time who were building temples and shrines and weren't stuck to a castle. These guys could move around Russia and see information. Well, what they ended up doing was they put in a system that stops them. It counts them every mile and taxes them from the federal government. They put this all around the country. I'm trying to find what it was called again. I found the name for it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What Camille is now predicting is that you're going to see widespread sabotage, because that's what happens in those instances of barons taking control and a jubilee, everyone defaulting, no deals really getting done. And there's no realistic way Putin will be able to keep such a huge apparatus as he's developed over the years on expensive oil running. He bred them, but he won't be able to feed them anymore, is what he's saying. And so all of these people, because of their position or whatever, would sort of turn against the system and it would start breaking apart. And that brings us to our lesson today and the first big simulation wing. So when I read this, I said, well, that's a lot like the Ides of March. And the Ides of March are exactly the same. They were a time of debt forgiveness in Roman contracts. This is the Roman New Year and it's today. So I looked it up today and it's today. So the Ides of March is the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated. Beware the Ides of March. In ancient Rome, it was the day where all debts would be accounted for. Huge parties began after this, because this is the Roman New Year right now. That's why in the Roman calendar, September, October, November, December, the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th month, It had nothing to do with what it is now, the 9th, 10th, 11th, they were two off. We made our New Year's because of the Christian change the same time as Christmas, but in Roman times, New Year's is now. And the Ides of March are the beginning of that season. They begin the whole new year. And this is when yearly contracts, this is when you're, year in review, year one in review, we're from Rome. That's when you would do it right now. And one of the most amazing things when I think of it is, we go from Russia, which in its own mind is the modern Rome. That's why the Tsar is really the Caesar. And if you go through history, it went Rome and then the capital moved to Byzantium. To this day, we think of Byzantine as too complicated and too bureaucratic, and you got to apply, and it's all really, hard. What ended up happening was the people in Kiev, the Rus people, sort of Swedish, really, came down and were the ones who helped stabilize the Orthodox Church, which had grown out of Byzantium, which was falling to the Turks and became eventually Constantinople. But that's where the Orthodox Church came in. So Kiev is really the foundation of the Russian people and the Russian Empire. And you've heard a lot of people analyze that and all that stuff. So Russia, Byzantine, Rome. But the arc that we follow here is really this one on cryptography. And we've talked about it on the show before. The Byzantine generals problem is a huge piece of cryptography, a huge mental exercise in cryptography. And you hear it a lot in these proof of stake coins. They always go on about Byzantine generals problems. We're not selling coins here. This is not a distributed mechanism for consensus that we're talking about. But we are going to talk about something that is very familiar to most people in the crypto industry anyway, the Byzantine generals problem. So from Byzantium to the Byzantine generals problem. Our frame for Bitcoin for a long time has been, let's say, the trickle down of cryptography, a thing that was only used in state warfare and for years was only used in state warfare. And this is a perfect example. The Byzantine generals problem is when you have some generals who are on your side, but you need a coordinated attack on the target. And the attack will only work if coordinated. It must be a coordinated attack. If it's not coordinated, you can't bother. So they have to make sure that everyone who acts is on their side. The limiting factors are you're not allowed to use a communication system, you're not allowed to use smoke signals, you're not allowed to use fire. You've got to just know from a series of messages that you send that you're going to be able to do this. So the Byzantine generals problem allows a general to, with confidence, know that even though he's got traitors in his midst, he can launch a centralized attack on a sieged city. Here, our siege city, in my view, is actually our brains. And what I'm arguing is that when cryptography all those years ago began, Rome, all those years, Byzantium time, and now finally to the Russian time, we see what happens when cryptography is only on one side of the equation. But with Bitcoin and with all these other things, we're seeing that we can actually now start planning attacks that are not coordinated. One of the crazy things about what's going on with the Byzantine, this problem, especially with the way the Russians are concerned, everybody has to be in on it for it to work. For the Russian attack here, for this thing to work, not one party, if, for example, Alexander Ovechkin, a very famous hockey player, were to say, pay me in Bitcoin, right? He would suddenly be removed from Putin's team, if you will. Ovechkin's mother was an Olympic athlete, heavily courted by the Putin administration. Ovechkin himself has been heavily courted by the Putin administration. But it's very difficult for someone like Alexander Ovechkin to make a political protest. His mother, for God's sakes, is a hostage, for lack of a better word. So one of the cool things that we can actually start imagining is Bitcoin provides you with this opportunity to actually be outside of the coordination of a lot of these institutions because you're in a different form of money now. So, as Bitcoiners, we should be focusing on, in particular, Russian refugees at this point, because the Russian situation has created more potential Bitcoiners than I think anything. All these credit card companies that have been virtue signaling, we don't like Russia and all that stuff, they actually just cut off the credit cards to the refugees who left Russia, maybe in protest for what was going on. It wasn't the credit cards in Russia that ended up getting clipped. It was the people who left and fled. So you have all of these refugees right now really looking probably to pay for their Airbnbs and their hotels and all that stuff. So a lot like what happened with Canada with its truckers, we have all of a sudden seen a super spreader event. And I saw Kraken and Jesse Powell say they were going to give $1,000 to every Ukrainian resident user of the platform. tremendous idea, and I think totally appropriate. But I think we need to start focusing on Russians as well, who are refugees, who really could use Bitcoin right now, probably want nothing to do with Putin. And they help us in this world where we don't need a coordinated attack. The thing that Bitcoiners can do is an uncoordinated attack. And I'll show you a little bit about what it looks like, because if we're thinking of jubilees, we're thinking of changing orders, we're thinking of the different parties that want to get into it. We mentioned Ovechkin. If it's not medicine, if it's not the news, if it's not athletes and the banks and the courts and religion that are all doing it at the same time, there are cracks. The thing about Bitcoin is, if you look at this case, we could take Ovechkin, but let's look in Brooklyn yesterday. You have Kyrie Irving, an American basketball player who was banned by one rule that said he's not allowed to play in the game. So what does Kyrie Irving do? He bought court seat tickets, which was according to the rules, because the fans could sit without a mask. So here's a guy who is completely making fun of the system as it is. And in the press conference after, his teammate, Kevin Durant, who some people say is the greatest basketball player other than LeBron James, Kevin Durant said, and I think it was a huge moment, he actually criticized New York's mayor. And if you want to know what a lot of people would like to see, it's a healthy political debate that isn't just based on skin color, but is based on ideas. And a lot of people, what they saw there was Kevin Durant. A lot of people are celebrating New York City has an African-American mayor. The Brooklyn Nets are a big team. Kevin Durant is a big hero in the Brooklyn community. But here he is criticizing the mayor and really shaking up the political box. This is another one of those instances where not everyone's on the same page, because these are normal things that people would disagree about. If you look at some of the, let's call it, persuasion that a fellow like Elon Musk is using right now, right? When Elon Musk is out there challenging a duel, challenging Putin to a duel, he gets so much attention for what he's doing. And it really forces you to see the world in a whole new way. When you're saying, I'm going to challenge you in a duel, what does that force you to do? Right away, you say, well, what does that look like compared to what we're already doing? It actually looks better, right? The idea of these two guys fighting, your brain forces you to see it that way. You take Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister, he said the same thing today, right? One guy, he doesn't need a bunch of institutions, although I think he probably has some help on what he's doing. But he goes today with this, way over the top thing, which I think is effective, where he tells the Russian soldiers in his country that if they surrender, they're going to get treated better in Ukraine than they would have been treated in Russia. So he's not arguing, we might win the war, we could win the war, who knows, it looks better than we were. No. He's already forcing you to go way ahead and say, we've already won the war, now we're going to treat you better. We're going to treat you better than you were treated by the people who sent you here. This is something where you're basically, you don't need the coordination. You're putting the thoughts in the person's head and forcing them to see what will happen afterwards. And you can do that with just one person. It doesn't require the extreme coordination of every institution in the world. So when I think of this trickle down of cryptography and all the things it solves, we see it was in Roman times, and then it went to the Byzantine generals. But in the end, the Byzantine generals' problem, this coordinated attack, is kind of their problem. That's kind of like the fiat world's problem, right? They've got to keep the oil and gas people happy. They got to keep the cartels on their side with their money as the reserve. They've got to do all that. If you're coming from the Bitcoin world, all you need is one Kyrie Irving for now. All you need is doing what he did, doing that super high level of persuasion. It doesn't require coordination from the medical industry. The medical industry will have a debate about what Kyrie Irving did. It's much more persuasive than someone just making an argument. He's out there showing the world it's full of clowns, it's full of morons and stupid people. And when you actually think about it, it's about fault tolerance. So when we think of the Byzantine generals' problem, it's about fault tolerance. How many mistakes can a system hold and not break? What I'm saying is the fiat world has a lot of Byzantine fault intolerance. It requires a heavily coordinated media, a heavily coordinated regulatory infrastructure, a heavily coordinated Hollywood infrastructure, a heavily coordinated athletic infrastructure. And when these pieces start falling apart, everything changes really quick, and we get to the Ides of March, we get to Jubilee time, we get to total and complete change when people like Kyrie Irving can sort of go on about stuff. Now the simulation is winking, you know. Kyrie Irving is known for flat Earth stuff, right? So I'm obviously not defending flat Earth, but I will tell you a little interesting note about flat Earth. Do you know what flat Earth might have been? The Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, we were actually, and this is the wink part, I was talking about it with Q, our colleague on the show, who you'll hear from in a second, yesterday, about the Washington Redskins and the whole, you know, what is a Redskin? And I said, actually, doesn't really just mean a pejorative name for First Nations people. It can also mean the ritualistic painting of skin of the priestly class of the Phoenician Empire, who were the ones that Rome beat in order to become the Roman Empire. They had to beat the Carthaginians. They had a bunch of names, but basically Tunisia, right? Carthage, Tunis, Tatooine, if you're into Star Wars, that little country on the south. That place there was Carthaginian, and the Romans beat it. And it could be that flat Earth was basically just propaganda, because it looks like the Phoenicians knew the world was round and sailed to all kinds of places in the world. It's sort of unproven, but there's this idea that there isn't enough iron in Europe to actually have the Iron Age. And where was it? Where was all the copper mined? Some people think it was mined many thousands of years ago in Michigan, because there are signs of copper being pulled out and no copper found amongst the Amerindian people. And that's what makes the story of Jekyll Island so amazing. There's also no history of child sacrifice in all of North American, Native American culture. It's not a thing they did. They loved their kids. There was wars and all kinds of craziness, but it was not like the hunter-gatherer families dealing with children in that way. And when they found Jekyll Island, if you read the book Creature from Jekyll Island, it was actually an astonishing thing that there were people with the red. They put the red on their skin, right? They had, right near Washington, D.C., they put the red on their skin. And there are some people who think it came from the Vikings, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and all that stuff. Now, I don't know anything about it, but if you read The Creature from Jekyll Island, they say there's a lot of weird stuff and we don't know where the red came from and who knows and what's going on there. And so this flat Earth thing actually comes from a time where they didn't want anyone to know that the Earth was round, because they had the trade imbalance and all that. But there is an idea that that stuff goes that far back. So the fault tolerance aspect, now skipping ahead to this Byzantine general's problem again, the fault tolerance of everything that goes around that requires everyone to keep up their part. On the other end, a Bitcoin attack on the system can be uncoordinated. It requires only a few people here and there in order to make it work, if they're persuasive enough, especially when you think about conditions like this, right? And this comes from Bitcoin Norway, and it's our last thought of the day. Imagine working a 9 to 5 every day for 40 years. Then a guy named Jerome Powell prints 40% of the US dollar supply in 2 years. And in the end, that itself is enough to break down the type of coordination that is required. That itself opens the doors to Jubilee and the Ides of March and a complete reordering and a complete breakup, and hopefully hyperbitcoinization, which we love because it's so much better than hyperinflation.
Nolan, you must have been listening to us when I brought up the Kyrie Irving of it all earlier in today's episode.
No, I missed the earlier part. But Kyrie Irving, I mean,
I completely agree with what you're saying.
Isn't it the best?
However, I'm going to challenge you on this, because I made a point to even look up the Washington Redskins logos from as far back as 1932 when they were formed, and it was a Native American man with the headdress on. So while yes, there are.
I'm not defending them. I'm just saying that there's another origin to the word red that isn't about skin. It's about paint. I understand
that there are other uses for the term redskin. However, in this instance, it was literally meant to be used as that same derogatory term that was used against.
But I also wanted to mention it just because
it exists. You're absolutely right. It exists.
And look,
it was not the use case in this example.
No. But the thing that the Juicy Smollett guy did in the court the other day,
yes.
And he said, I'm in good shape, because he was reminding us of the other guy who did the thing with the stuff, and he can't talk about him. He had one of those massage baths, a Phoenician bath, in the island. Right, just in case you were wondering, right? Like an actual one, like not a little bit of one, a real one, right? A real one, right? And it's funny, Juicy Smollett, that's another wink from the simulation, because that's all happening at the same time. How do we know so much about the Juicy Smollett case? What about the other one? What about the other one?
Do you know what happened with the Jesse Smollett case?
Yeah.
For those of our audience that don't know, this is an actor who I believe he was on one of the NBC network bullshit shows or whatever.
I don't
Power, no, Empire. It was on Fox. He was in Empire. And he made claims that while he was in Chicago, he was jumped and beaten up by two individuals claiming like, you're a black man, like, fuck you, and we're going to beat you up. It was later found out that it was actually staged because when they arrested the people who beat him up, they, of course, were not paid nearly enough money to keep their mouths shut to go to jail. And they turned around and they said, well, here's the bank statement that Jesse Smollett sent us to pay him to beat him up so that he can stage this. I mean, when I was literally working in Hollywood as an agent when that happened, and the running joke was he was probably the smallest part in Empire as far as being locked into the show. So he couldn't be on any other TV shows, but he also wasn't getting enough for his own ego to be satisfied. And so the whole theory was he was doing this to essentially boost his notoriety, try to land a couple of movie roles that he was close on but did not land.
I'm mentioning to his illusions about what could happen to him in prison and that he was in good shape. And then the other guy,
I mean, look, I'm too pretty to go to jail. I'll say it right now, and I'll say it anytime. I'm way too pretty to go to jail. That is not a place for someone like me. But nor is this a place for someone like Jesse Smollett. But you do something stupid and you get caught.
Yeah, I was ready to let it all go. I mean, a lot of sounds like a rough sentence. I think his career was enough punishment. I was sort of over it by then, but looks like there was other stuff,
I have one quick thing to add, Nolan. So pulling it back to you were saying about Ovechkin, the hockey player, obviously, and while he's residing in the United States, plays for the Washington Capitals and such, it's kind of like he's in a weird spot that, to your point, Nolan, that he was like, he can't really revolt openly without fear of his mother and siblings or anyone that resides still back in Russia. And
which is what makes Bitcoin so effective. Like this is their problem. It's not, they say it from a cryptographic point of view, Bitcoin solved the Byzantine generals problem. And from a tech point of view, what I'm saying is it solved it from a human point of view. Like we don't need to coordinate to attack fiat at all. We don't need any coordination. None. Zero. If Ovechkin takes Bitcoin, the pay me in Bitcoin meme is so powerful and the context around it so excusable that what trouble could he possibly be in if Ovechkin decides to get paid in Bitcoin? Like what trouble could he possibly be in? Nevertheless, it's as revolutionary an act as a person like that could take right now. If Ovechkin said, pay me in Bitcoin and said to the Russian refugees, let's all do this, I think we're out of trouble in a couple of weeks. Right.
Yeah, I guess tying one more point to that, though. So obviously, it would not be in Ovechkin's family's best interest if he spoke out against Putin, but also Putin. Yeah,
the mother took too much money over the years. The mother was too. I don't know if she knew she was an Olympic athlete, before she had him. So, what do these people know? Sometimes she's an athlete. I'm sure she heard he was bad, but she's got to deal with all this stuff, right? There's a lot going into her head out there in Russia that we don't know anything about. And all of a sudden it was a job, it was respect, it was everything. She was a federal employee. She was running, as I understand, like a feel-good Olympic tea party situation, right? Like, yay, let's go do Olympic stuff here and there. And he was such a big proponent. You remember what he would say to the NHL, the Professional Hockey League in America, I'm not even going to play in your league if there's the Olympics. He himself held the league to the fire when it came to the league's decision to play in the Olympics because insurance, and it's not like basketball, different seasons, summer and winter, they got to take time off. So it's not in the league's interest to go to the Olympic Games. And Ovechkin would fight against that because he was so in the bag. I think in innocent ways. I don't know really, but I mean, when I look at Ovechkin, I see what Russia ought to be. I see as playful and childish or whatever as he is. He still reminds me of the great Russian minds out there, the Dostoevskys, in its own way, right? He's a genius in his own way.
And
I have a really, oh, sorry.
one more
I
thing,
just
and then
want,
I'll let. Okay.
I wanted to share an Ovechkin story because I actually met the man while I was in college. I worked for the Washington Capitals, and for one of their like season ticket holder events, all of the players came, mingle with the season ticket holders, and they had one of those what is it? See how fast your shot is. And so everyone was participating. Of course, Ovechkin shows up, and I'm the one like maintaining this machine. I'm a 19-year-old like kid, like, oh my God, this is the dude. He took 4 different shots and none of them broke above 50 miles per hour. And this was when he had like famously had like 75 mile per hour or faster slap shots. Turns to me with a very angry Russian accent and face going, "This is broken. You shouldn't let people play on this. It is broken." And then walks away. That is all. Sorry to interrupt you, Chris.
Here, I got a good one too. Just to show you what I saw from this person. I knew one of the guys at the Montreal Canadiens security. He would just do between the players and the fans where they all come out. And he would actually run the garage where the kids would come at the end of the game to get autographs. And he goes, "I'll tell you, man, there's nobody like Ovi. He comes down, where are the kids? Where are the kids? Like, where are the kids?" And not a hesitation. No one prods him. Like Sidney Crosby, his sort of nemesis or whatever you want to say, the Canadian hockey player who people compare to a lot. And Sidney's all business. He's, if he's got time,
I disagree with that. I will not let you slander Sidney Crosby. I worked at the agency that repped him. He makes a point to answer all fan mail. You are wrong about that.
I bet. I don't want to say anything. He just said when he's at the ice and he's at the rink, he's thinking of one thing. I'm not trying to paint Sidney Crosby as a bad guy.
That's fair, but that is a man who literally asks for all of his.
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that. He did the coolest thing when he won the Stanley Cup. He brought it home to his friend. He plays street hockey, and they played for it on his street. And he always has to play goalie because he's too good. But they actually like played for it.
Chris, we interrupted you. Please pick up where we left off.
Yeah, so I guess Nolan, my last thing. So Putin, obviously, right now, we all know it invaded Ukraine. Even if Ovechkin were to speak out against him, that would be very detrimental to his family. But Putin's looking for some easy wins. Wouldn't that not show a faltering of his group or following? He's worried about the Ukraine thing. Why would he go out of his way to harm a Russian citizen on their own if Ovechkin?
I don't think he's worried about Ukraine. I think they've lost. I think they're gone. I think Ukraine outright beat them. I think his worry now is internal. Though when we compare to courtiers and barons, the barons are coming. And if you leave, so it was in the thread. I recommend to go read it. I can't remember his name right now, but he's the Chechen fella that they brought up to fight in Ukraine. He is from the Chechen division or whatever of the Russian army.
Yep.
And they brought him up to fight. By the way, the red ochre beard, right? That's another part of that old Phoenician thing. That's where the red dye comes in the beard. So he's got, a long beard. And this fella, apparently, if you take the predictions of the fellow that I mentioned, the Galiv guy, is going to get downgraded soon. When we see sabotage, it's going to be on a guy like that. Generals who make publicity stunts like this is apparently all self-scripted. That's what this guy's intelligence is telling him. This guy came up from Chechnya himself, more or less, and if he's going to get too much attention, because now the game is internal. Anyone who could bring authority back to Moscow, and this guy he can actually fight in Moscow. He can march that army up to Moscow if you're not paying attention. And that's where attention now is. They don't give a shit. I mean, all those tanks, when they found out, which we said first in this show, we said before World War III started, when we said World War III started, we said you'd see aircraft carriers and F-35s just fall off the deck. $5 billion planes destroyed by $35 worth of drone technology. It's not $35, but those Stingers and those things they sent to Ukraine mean there's no such thing as tanks anymore. They're useless. You can't have a war with tanks. It's the dumbest thing you can do. Because the kits, have you seen the kits they are using? It's a 2-person job. You get one thing that tells you everything in heat signature that's going on miles away, and then you shoot it, and then you just leave. You're gone. You're gone by the time, we are way gone by the time it hits its target. It comes straight down from the sky. What we got to worry about is I haven't got good intelligence on it yet, but I've heard some of those Starlink satellites are getting pushed around up in space, right? There's a lot of theories on what's going on with them. And we don't know. It could be natural. It could be anything. We don't know much about low orbit. It's kind of a new thing that Elon Musk is doing here. But I'd say that's more worrying for what's going on over there than tanks. I mean, if Russia's got satellite push around technology, we got a problem, all right? But if it's just the tanks they're rolling in, see ya, bye. No more tanks. It doesn't matter.
Nolan, and to your point, I think you even brought up on the show as well, aside from Russia having more superior nukes, they have much better anti-aircraft and anti-ballistic missile systems too. So I know you even said you coined it. You're like, we're worried if they start shooting satellites out of the atmosphere. That's a lot bigger issue than rolling tanks or ships or aircrafts across the Atlantic, basically.
I'm not worried about anything World War III hardware related till I see something in space that we haven't seen before. If something happens in space that we haven't seen before, look out.
Yep.
Look out.
That's all I got. Q, if you have anything else to wrap it up.
Stay humble. Stack sats. Use code YTMAG and get 10% off your Bitcoin. 22 tickets. I think that's a wrap for today, guys.
Have a good one, everyone. Peace out.